Again, a bunch of various diagrams. You can use these for anything. If you really want to get very complicated about it, you can look at these kind of things here. And again, this class, we're going to be talking about this middle area mostly. I think we're going to be leaving this area, the neurotic personality organization. In other words, sort of normal level, low level pathologies, normal level stuff. And we're going to start talking about this stuff in here. Yeah. And we're not going to talk about psychotic stuff. That's, you take my other class when I get to teach that, and we'll talk about psychosis. All right. So more of this. Kernberg, very important guy. You can look at his kind of thing. We're going to talk a little bit about introversion, extroversion when I start talking about personality disorders. All right, so more of the stuff. We're going to talk about narcissism in specifically. I'm going to talk a little bit about narcissism later on. And I have a take on narcissism. It's slightly different than this, but overlaps. So just get ready for that. That's an interesting thing. Blah, 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 neurotic stuff. So I want to talk to you about, this is one of the last things I'm going to talk about, neurotic personality organization. So I want to give you this case history. This comes from my dad. It's one of his cases. George was a physician in his mid-30s, had an obsessional character, went into treatment because of his puzzlement and distress over his wife's leaving him. And clear during the therapeutic process, he'd been a virtual slave to his wife during their 7 years of marriage. He'd gone out of his way to please her, giving her gifts he could not afford, doing dishes, emptying the garbage, when he's a busy doctor, rubbing her back to help her sleep when his hands are tired, so on, so on, so on. Underneath this compliant behavior smoldered a silent hostility and denial of his dependence on a woman. George's mother had been an adopted child, one who clung to the fantasy that she'd originally been born into a noble family. When George was born to her, she conveyed to him her passion to be recognized as glorious and expected him to realize her fantasy by attaining great fame. Her attitude accounted in some measure for her son's behaving like a slave to please women, including his ex-wife and his ex-wife, and continued resentment of them. Okay. George's already stressed relationship with his mother had an added complication when he reached the Oedipal stage. Okay. Mother was in the habit of leaving her husband's bed during the night and wandering from room to room of the house, going bed to bed. This awakened the boy's fantasies, Oedipal fantasies about claiming her from the father, who was often disparaged in his presence. The growing boy took a secret pride in the belief that he would surpass his father and not only become a better man, but one more greatly loved by his mother. He could not escape the idea, however, that his father would punish him for having such Oedipal ancestral wishes. His father often beat little George for behavior that offended his mother, since it often expressed the child's wish to be free of her. George had to bend over before his father and allow himself to be struck. A year after George began his psychoanalytic treatment, it seemed his incestuous wishes in his boyhood had barely been repressed. Since childhood, whenever he had masturbated, he often fantasized a sexual encounter with his mother. Soon after inner puberty, George amputated his toe accidentally, and his dreams showed that this was an act of self-castration to foil any castration that his father might attempt. This is an interesting thing. You'll find that this sort of fear of castration, this sort of classical Oedipal fear of castration, a lot of times the person will preempt it by doing something that is symbolically related to being castrated. They'll do it themselves to forestall the actual castration from the father, which, in standard Freudian language, this is thought of, back in the day as castration. But we can also think of this castration as being killed, right? Not existing anymore. And so think of it I think of it either way. So rather than be killed by the father, I will do something that will appease him, and then I don't have to be killed. Right. So that's what we find in this situation. His self-castration helped him repress the fear of the father. However, this fear was betrayed in certain fantasies. For example, as an adult, he would fantasize that the husband or lover of any woman in whom he felt interest would meet with an automobile accident and then die. On many occasions, he himself would have an accident in his car. So again, getting into car accidents over and over and over again is a form of self-castration to avoid the fear of the actual castration or fear of being killed. George's father died of cancer soon after his son's marriage. At the moment of his death, the younger couple were having intercourse in the room just below the death chamber. George's association to this led him to understand that he wanted to have sex with his wife while his father was dying, and this act primarily was designed to show the dying man that his son now had his own women and no interest in the father's wife. Okay? In other words, he didn't have interest in his mother anymore. He had his own wife, right? That's what he's trying to show. The father still afraid of this castration, death from the father thing. So at one level, he wishes to resolve his Oedipal complex magically just before his father died, in a sense, saying to the old man, see, I have my woman and you have your woman, my mother. Both of us are men with our own women. There's no need for competition. There's no need for murder or castration. At the beginning of the third year of his psychoanalysis, George's realization of his magical wish to resolve his Oedipal complex quickly and his deeper emotional understanding of his unresolved Oedipal conflict allowed him to feel closer to the image of his father. In turn, he could now mourn over losing him. My dad says, I was moved to see this obsessional individual weep very genuinely for his father's death on the couch after 2 years of treatment. After his mourning over his father in the third year of analysis, George could bring his Oedipal struggle in full force to his psychoanalysis and develop a full-blown transference neurosis. Okay, so now my dad, as the analyst, is now being seen in that parental role as the father, and he's now going to play out the transference in the sessions, during the sessions. Okay. In the transference, I became the Oedipal father. George became involved with the secretary of another psychiatrist who appeared in his dreams wearing a mustache. I had a mustache at the time, but my colleague did not. George was fusing the other psychiatrist with me into one image. When I did not say anything and waited for the transference to become a workable transference neurosis, George gave up the affair and began clearly disparaging me during the sessions. Now it's the negative transference, right? At the same time, he also feared me. Again, I did not interfere. Then George began to have a ritual during his sessions. He would sit on the couch before lying down to remove his contact lenses. After the session was over, he would sit on the couch and replace the lenses before leaving. In a sense, he was symbolically plucking out his eyes. Remember the myth of Oedipus? I told you the myth of Oedipus, right? He's plucked out his eyes, which is a form of self-castration, not unlike having an accident or losing his toe. Because he would do this himself, he could not be castrated. He could not be killed or murdered, because he was already castrated. I did nothing about this ritual until George had a dream in which he attacked a representation of me, which was still another psychiatrist, while forgetting to remove his contact lenses before the fight and injuring his cornea. George felt anxiety on my couch, and I told him what I understood about his ritual. So at this point now, there is a interpretation of this, what's going on, because you can clearly now what's going on is the analyst can see the pattern here, right? He's doing all these things where he's substituting in things, castrating things, symbolically castrating himself so he doesn't have to worry about being murdered or castrated by the father figure. Okay? After this, George stopped his rituals but had fantasies of a miracle cure that would restore his eyes to 20/20 vision. Again, he would magically undo his castration. When this was interpreted, he began experiencing more naked Oedipal struggles. So sometimes when stuff like this is interpreted, it becomes almost like a form of permission to really, really dig into this stuff. And that's a good sign, actually, in this case. George wanted me to be hypnotized so he could open his memory box. And when he told me that he wanted me to move into him by means of hypnosis, he came with the idea that I had a curved penis, right? So now I'm in fantasies about the analyst. I was a terrible Turk. My dad's Turkish, by the way, with a scimitar, curved penis that he used to decapitate people. So now the Oedipal stuff is really becoming right in the front, barely disguised at this point. Okay. George blanched and shook with anxiety on the couch. He then recalled himself that he had a curved penis. He thought, I must have a double curve. And finally, after some weeks, he decided that mine had the shape of the letter S. For him, S stood not only for snake, but also for shit. So that means anal phase symbol, right? George recalled defecating in the living room, the floor at the age 4, and seeing the family dog eat his excrement. He recalled his amazement, delight, and fear over the episode with the affect, shit is powerful, he remarked. And I told him not to consider the idea that if one eats bodily material or body part of another, he can steal the other's characteristics such as power. Okay, so again, this is something you will see if you do some therapy with people who have anal phase stuff, that they will often have all sorts of weird shit dreams. Okay. So that's another really interesting thing. We could talk more about that, but we probably won't get into that more, but that's an interesting thing. Then George gets fellatio fantasies. He talked about his realization that he wants to eat my penis, right? So again, you will see if you do these kind of long-term therapies with these kind of people that they will become quite many times, if there's an Oedipal thing going on, they'll also have sort of lots of curiosity about your sexual life and your sexual organs, and in this case, the incorporation of the father figure. And this is what the eating of the penis symbolizes, right? So he had these fantasies for days and days and days, shakes with anxiety, while again, the analyst is staying silent, right? Most of the time, not intervening here, letting these fantasies just come out. Okay. Soon George is able to report good things about his father and realizes anger toward his mother for keeping him, as he felt, from being friendly with his father. And slowly he began to feel friendly toward me. And this is sort of, now you can get the sense of him working through the Oedipal complex. What George had done very easily can be explained by the classical descriptions of transference and transference neurosis. George owned the opposing aspects of his conflict within himself, especially after some previous unconscious aspects of his conflicts were brought to his attention. And this case shows that transference neurosis is a new version of the patient's neurosis. Okay? In it, the analyst becomes the focal figure upon whom conflicts between instinctual drives and defenses against them, originally part of the childhood experience, are displaced. The feelings a patient experiences during transference neurosis are uniquely vivid in the present, so upon being interpreted, they become very authentic. Patient feels convinced of the relevance of the interpretations and his or her understanding of what has been repeated in the analyst's office. So again, they're repeating out these childhood relationships, these child symbolic relationships, now in the therapy sessions, during the sessions, right? And again, a lot of this weird stuff comes up because the person's lying on the couch, they're facing away. This is sort of, in a way, the power of free association, right? Because if you were sitting face to face with a therapist, you're not going to start talking about fantasies about wanting to eat their genitals or whatever it might be, right? You're going to be, your censor is going to come up. You're going to start censoring yourself. And this is one of the powerful things about analysis, and also a powerful thing about the analyst, not intervening or saying anything, not being directed. You're just facing the wall, you're in a dim room, things just start coming out, right? And this is the way you're really accessing the unconscious. And again, you can think of all sorts of myths that this relate to. You know, if you look back in the history of literature and, you know, mythology and everything, you find all sorts of myths. The Oedipal myth is one, but you see all sorts of other ones. The other one I think is very relevant to this case, in sense, is Cronus the Titan. You know about Cronus the Titan? That there was a prophecy, you know, the Titans were like the precursors to the Olympian gods. And in Cronus, there was a prophecy that, you know, his children would rise up and kill him. And so when his children were born, he would eat them, right? And eventually Zeus is born, but I don't know what you call it, the nanny, whoever, hides him, you know, and gives Cronus a rock to eat, right? And eats the rock. Zeus grows up, he's able to go and pull all his brothers and sisters out of Cronus and attack him and overthrow him. And that's, yeah. So again, this idea comes up, you know, in the transference of the, you know, if you have the Oedipal kind of thing, is castrating thing, but also you'll see this idea of incorporation, right? Incorporation, that the fear is the father is going to consume you, you know, sometimes the mother or the father is going to consume you, it's going to incorporate you. You're not going to be able to individuate as your own person because of this fear that you're going to be incorporated, right? So that's another thing. We might talk a little bit about that more later on. But again, there's lots of myths about this kind of stuff. I thought I'd give you a case. This is a real psychoanalytic case. You know, this is a pretty typical one for like a long-term psychoanalysis. You know. Any thoughts about this? Weird, huh? Yeah, weird, yeah. So again, you know, when you start doing longer term therapy with people, more weird stuff is going to come up. Now, I will tell you, because it's a class on personality disorders, if the weird stuff comes up right away, like in the first 2 or 3 sessions, your meter will go into red about this person may have a personality disorder. Okay. You know, in this case, it took this guy, you know, a while before, you know, the real weird fantasies, the real Oedipal stuff, unconscious stuff really was able to come out, right? and that's a sign of neurosis. If the weird stuff starts coming out like in the first, month of session, or even sometimes even in the first session, that's a red flag that the person over disclosing. Over disclosure is often when they're in, at least with borderline personality disorder, my experience, often something you get right away, and that should be a little bit of a red flag. The person maybe have more primitive pathology, the over disclosure, but it's coming out over a period of years, on the couch. I mean, this guy was probably in analysis for at least 3 years, 4 or 5 times. Yes.
When you say over disclosure, does that mean talking about personal things or just over explaining things?
So, it's just like if you met somebody for the first time, you meet them for the first time, you don't really know them, you're talking, and within 15 minutes of the conversation, you start telling me how your alcoholic father used to go outside and, to a thorn bush and come in and, beat your butt with it, within 15 minutes of the conversation. If that was a normal friendship, you just met somebody you didn't know before and started telling you go, right? That's what kind of stuff would happen. So I saw this in borderline patients. This was pretty consistently come in something that would be inappropriate to tell somebody you didn't know would come out very quickly, sometimes the first session. You also see it, by the way, parallel to that. You also see it sometimes when people come in and they've been seeing a bunch of different therapists. That's the other time you see over disclosure. They've seen a bunch of different therapists. They don't want to have to repeat the story or get to the point where the trouble was, so they just blurt it out right away. Let's just get back to the point where I was with my last therapist. And so they try to give you everything all at once so that you get to that point, without building it up like they had to do with their previous therapy. That's another time you see it. So again, if you're seeing over disclosure, ask about previous therapy. That's another thing. If you've been seeing another therapist before, when you've seen another therapist, if you don't know that already. If you do know it, that's another time you sometimes will see the sort of over disclosure thing. But if you don't see that, then sometimes it will be similar personality disorder. Just borderline personality, in my experience. But I mean, again, this guy 4 or 5 times a week for 3 or 4 years. He's seeing my dad, in the office, and so after that amount of time, stuff starts coming out. Right, and I would say even in psychoanalytic psychotherapy, stuff. You're going once a week. You've seen somebody a year. It takes a little while for stuff to come out. And what you can see is you'll see the dream. At least not all the time. It's not an absolute rule, but you'll see in the dreams will start becoming a little bit wilder, right? The dream stuff. In other words, the person establishes a therapeutic alliance. They start establishing transference with the therapist. And then what happens is that the dreams, the unconscious stuff in the dreams becomes more, it's almost like it's more acceptable to present that stuff. And then in the free association, more stuff, remembering more dreams. That's another thing. People start to remember their dreams. You don't have to tell them to remember their dreams. They'll just start reporting on it. The dreams will, I had a dream last night, and they'll just start reporting on it. And the dreams will become a little wilder. So some of these things you see in here, these strange things about genital things and, about especially anal things, this stuff will start coming out, will bubble up, right? And the idea is, in a way, in psychoanalysis, especially in classical psychoanalysis, is to allow it to bubble up organically. You're not pushing it to happen, right? There are offshoots of psychoanalytic therapy, especially the ones that were developed in the 60s, Fritz Perls, Gestalt therapy, these things, where the idea is you're going to push people, right? You're going to be directed and push this stuff out of them. Doesn't work so well. I think it's better to let things bubble up a little bit organically, because then it's not like you're trying to present stuff to the therapist who's pushing you to please them, right? Though that can happen also unconsciously as well. This is kind of a typical kind of neurotic case. Not that typical. It's a little weird, but it's a good, rich neurotic case. Any questions about that? And I'm assuming you guys don't have experience doing therapy with an individual for a long period of time, like a year or 2 years. Yeah. So that is something. So again, if you were to do this kind of work, say you want to be an analyst or psychoanalytic therapist, you would graduate, you get your license, you go down to LA to Santa Monica, you sign up for the psychoanalytic psychotherapy program. You go Wednesday nights, and take some classes. You're repeating a lot of the stuff that I've said. And then what you would do is you would have somebody, you would get a case, more of these kind of long-term cases. The idea is you'd be seeing people, you'd be a little open-ended. Okay. And again, this is something too that I should point out that's a difference that, this kind of therapy is open-ended. There's not a termination date set in advance. It's not like you're going to see 8 sessions, you're going to do 50 sessions, whatever. This is open-ended, right? So it just allows all the time. So if you're being a therapist, you're going to see somebody, generally it's going to be open-ended. There are variations of psychotherapy that are not open-ended, they're closed-ended, where there's a limited number of sessions. I think I mentioned to you the dream work that I've trained in under Jungian analyst, which is closed in stuff. They're roughly 8 sessions. You do it in 8 session intervals. You can do more. You can add sessions on, but you do 8 and then you wait and see, and then you might do another 8. You might you do them in 8-week chunks, right? There's a reason for that. I could talk about that, but that's not typically how psychoanalytic therapy is. That's generally open-ended. So if you were to go to one of these institutes and train, you would then get clients that would come to see you, they'd be referred to you, and then you would take on some long-term cases, right? So you take on some open-ended cases, and then you get supervision, right? Because again, getting these long-term cases, especially if you've been trained, you've only been doing short-term stuff, to get long-term stuff, it's really, really very necessary to have supervision, right? Very necessary to have supervision. I'm a big fan. I think even experienced therapists should be getting supervision and consult. When you're experienced, we call it consultation rather than supervision, but it's the same idea, right? In this kind of thing, you would have some supervision. Yes.
Like in a lot of behavioral therapies, the quote unquote end goal is to get the person to the point where they don't need therapy anymore.
Yeah.
Is that's still a goal in psychoanalytic therapy? It just takes longer, or is
Yeah.
that really not?
Yeah, no, I would say that is the goal. I mean, the goal is that basically you can even make it more specific than that. In a way, the goal is that you're helping the person to internalize the therapy. In other words, rather than going and sitting in the office and going, hearing what the therapist has to say, before the therapist would say something, the person will interpret to themselves, oh, there I go again. That's my Oedipal issue or whatever, blah, blah, blah. And that's actually one of the signs that the person is probably getting ready to terminate therapy, that they probably may not need therapy so much anymore. Is when they start interpreting for themselves, they'll have the insight. In other words, that interpretive function the therapist plays is now internalized in the person, and they're able to do that themselves. And that would be one of the, that's a good sign. You don't need a therapist because you can internalize yourself, right? You're the therapist's voice in your own head, right? You can do the therapist function yourself for yourself. You don't need somebody else to do it, right? Now, of course, Freud said everybody should get reanalyzed every 5 years. Of course, in practice, that never happens. But what you'll find as a therapist, if you're working as a therapist, you'll find that you'll work with people, you'll do great, people will get well, they'll start being able to go up on their own. And then what will happen is you'll find that you'll get cases where you get stuck, because we all have blind spots. And that's the point when you need to go get consultation or maybe, touch up your own therapy process, right? Maybe, and again, I think I mentioned this other time, a lot of times the consultation and supervision has an element of your own therapy. Like when I was being supervised, my supervisor would often point out, things from my family history that was impacting, what I was doing in the therapy hour. My countertransference would come up and he would comment about where that came from. Right? He knew me, he asked me questions, right? And so there can be a therapeutic aspect to consultation and supervision, but it's also good that you have your own, that you do your own therapy. Now, if you go into become a psychoanalyst, you go into a classical psychoanalytic program, you are going to be required to go into analysis yourself, something they call training and analysis, right? So this training analysis is like being analyzed, but it also will be there's also a little kind of supervision involved, because at the same time you're doing that, you are being supervised for cases. And so your cases and your work will come up in the analytic sessions. And so your training analysts will help you, see where your blind spots are a little bit. So they do have a little bit of at least in my opinion, a little bit of a supervision function, as well with your work, because your work will inevitably come up. You're training to be an analyst or a therapist, you're doing the work, and then you're going and you're doing your own analysis, it will come up. And so probably if you are going to do this kind of work, you want to do this sort of long-term sort of therapy work with people. Probably a good idea for you to get an experience of doing some long-term therapy. You go be in therapy for a year or 2, 3, and just get a sense of what it's like, what the process is. And then when you see things like this, you go, oh my God, you had this fantasy about eating this penis, weird stuff. It'll feel a lot less weird to you because you'll have had your own weird fantasies in your own therapy thing. You'll have your own weird dreams that you talk to therapists about that have some bizarre things, some less shocking to you, right? A lot of times the psychoanalytic stuff gets criticized because the stuff that comes up is very shocking, right? Oh my God, this is so shocking. People are talking about sex. They're talking about this very raw, unfiltered stuff that comes out from the unconscious. But when you experience that yourself, it's less shocking, right? When you understand that you have weird unconscious urges, just like your patients are going to have, it's less shocking, right? And also makes you more effective at dealing with this kind of stuff. Right? Make sense, kind of? I'll have more cases later on. I'm going to give you some more cases. We'll talk about personality disorder cases later. I have a couple more that we'll go through. Because I wanted to give you just a sort of standard psychoanalytic neurosis case, an Oedipal conflict case. A lot of times the Oedipal conflicts are not, at least as a therapist, not as an analyst, as a therapist, they're not as dramatic as this, right? So remember I talked about, I think I talked to you guys about this, that analysis is going really deep. The sense that the person's personality is almost going to be restructured. As whereas psychotherapy, it may be that the personality doesn't get restructured, it just becomes more adaptable to whatever the person's going. The person is able to adapt their own personality style, how they're put together to, whatever their life circumstances are. And in that situation, sometimes you'll see less of the really exotic, kind of fantasies and these kind of things. Now, obviously, we're putting this in the book. This is in the book. So we want to put the really weird stuff, shocking stuff in the book, because that's how you sell books, right? It's give you a sort of plain vanilla one. But I will give you some plain vanilla ones. Okay. I think that makes sense. All right. Good. Okay. Let's move on. And I think I want to do more rubber meets the road stuff. I know we're a little behind. I wanted to get to the personality sort of stuff that we may get to it, we may not. So don't worry about that. Did I talk about resistances already? Did I give you guys a slideshow? I should talk about this. I did do this one, right? I posted, but I didn't talk you through it yet, did I? No. Okay, let's do this one now. This is super important as well. So Freud was the one who kind of came up with this. Every step of treatment is accompanied by a resistance. Patients who are resistant are against being involved in the therapeutic process. Sabotage, their mostly unconscious way of dealing with their mental conflicts and influence of their unconscious pathogenic fantasies. In other words, the rut has already been, grooved into the road, and anything that that takes you out of that rut is really the person resists it. Right, they want to continue along the groove they've already cut down, even if it's causing them to be miserable. They don't want to have to deviate from that pattern they already have. Right, if you're a behaviorist, you can say they've been reinforced from this pattern. They want anything that tries to reinforce a different pattern is resisted against. Okay, and actually, I should really write a paper about this. I'm going to do it. You can really think about this sort of in a behavioral way if you want. Resistance, not simply a reaction to the personality of the psychoanalyst or therapist, okay, though their personal issues and experience can contribute to the resistance. And again, I talked a little bit about this before about the sort of flight into health that happens sometimes as a defense mechanism. That can be due to inexperience. Freud referred to 5 types of resistance: repression resistance, transference resistance, gain and illness resistance, repetition compulsive resistance, superego resistance. The first 3 types come from the ego. So this means that you, cognitive behavioral therapists, probably deal with these. And the 4th from the id, repetition compulsion, and the 5th from the superego. And this comes from Freud's books, Beyond the Pleasure Principle and the Question of Way Analysis. His works where he talks mostly about this. Okay, also in his other book, Analysis Terminable and Interminable, later on, he explains resistance even further. He distinguishes resistance that reflect the ego's defensive operations, so the things we just talked about, from those built into the nature of the psychic apparatus, which are ideologically independent of conflict. The latter include biological and constitutional factors. Freud referred to these as mobility of libido, loss of plasticity, adhesiveness of libido, traumatic experiences. So you can think of these kind of things as, sort of biological. How much energy do you have? When you have any biological things going on, your brain functioning properly, these kind of things. Okay. For Freud's psychoanalysis takes a long time because of strong resistance. This is the reason why we try to make psychoanalysis, psychoanalytic therapy organic and let the stuff bubble up. Because if you don't let it bubble up, if you're directive, then you're just punching right against the resistances. Okay. In a way, you're pushing back against them, and it strengthens. Almost a little like judo, right? Judo or aikido, right? If, good judo player, if they butt up against somebody, then it's just whoever's strongest is going to win. But if they skillfully use technique and they relax, they can use the own person's, resistance against them, right? So it's a little bit like psychoanalysis, a little bit like judo or aikido, in the sense that you want to let the person's own resistance, eventually work for them, right? And again, this is why we're interpreting these things. You don't want to just directly confront these things, okay? At least most of the time. Okay. Freud recognized them as a very intense and rigid resistance cannot be moved by psychoanalysis, and this is where treatment fails. So sometimes you have resistances that are so strong that you get treatment failure because of these things. Okay, and again, this is something that you would be thinking about if you were doing therapy. The resistance can't be overcome. This is where the therapy may fail, or maybe you need to try something different. Okay. Now, again, long-term versus short-term therapy. Generally, and I already just talked about this, generally psychoanalysis is considered to be a long-term psychotherapy. Glenn Gabbard, who has written a book on, very famous psychoanalyst, written a book on long-term therapy, he defines it as, because people say long-term, short-term, it's kind of like, what does this mean? There's all sorts of different definitions. His definition is any therapy that is more than 24 sessions or 6 months in duration would be considered to be long-term. I think that's actually a pretty good line in the sand, if you will, about what you want to consider to be long-term or not. I would say 6 months to me would seem to be pretty short. But that's what he's saying. So I think he's written a textbook on psychotherapy, psychoanalytic psychotherapy. So I think that's probably a pretty good way to think about it. There are several newer, shorter-term psychoanalytic therapies developed. He's not worked with resistances in the same way. In other words, they're going to just confront the resistances a little bit more head-on. They're used mostly for symptomatic relief rather than personality change and personality adaptive. They use other aspects of psychoanalytic psychotherapy more focused on symptom reduction. No real shortcut to working with resistance in any kind of psychoanalytically derived treatment. Okay, resistances are just a fact of doing therapy. Okay? And again, this is why it usually takes longer. So one example of this, in the 60s and 70s, there were several so-called humanistic psychotherapies that were developed. Many of these were created by psychoanalysts. By the way, lots of therapies were created by psychoanalysts. Aaron Beck, one of the fathers of CBT, was trained as an analyst. And of course, Aaron Beck very famously said, it's the relationship that cures. It's not what you're doing in the therapy session, right? So I think it's actually pretty right on. But they're also like a bunch of humanistic therapies and systems that are created by psychoanalysts. I had some experience with these. What they're trying to do is to shortcut the processes of working with defenses and resistances, right? They're trying to overcome these, sort of in some cases just by sheer brute force. And since I have some experience with these things, I'm a little bit critical. I like a lot of these humanistic therapies in some ways, especially if you're just a neurotic person, or you just want to, you want to activate your potential as a human being. You're not really dealing with pathology. You want to become a better person, achieve your ego ideal. I do think that they're really valuable. I don't want to seem like I'm too critical of them, but I'm a little critical of them as therapy, right? And my experience has been with Gestalt therapy, transactional analysis, and I mentioned primal screen therapy to you guys before. I encourage all of you to try somewhere on a deserted cliff out in the middle of nowhere. Go try it, see what the catharsis feels like. It's great, there's nothing wrong with doing it. Just give it a try. But the problem is if you're going to do this as a form of psychotherapy. And in my experience, these therapies lead to some insight into defense mechanisms and resistance. But to varying degrees, they rely on catharsis, right? That you're just going to, And one of the great kind of weird, you want to think of it as a resistance, is catharsis, right? I got it all out. I'm good now, and you can resist going deeper into therapy because you've had a cathartic experience. And Corey realized this very early on in his career, and he abandoned the idea of catharsis being a major therapeutic principle. And what you see in these therapies is that they engender catharsis. Once the catharsis is over, the person feels great. Oh, I'm cured now, and go away. And then, a month later, they got to come back and see this therapist again because now the thing that built up inside, the repressed stuff or whatever it is, now built back up, and they need to have another cathartic experience. Very good for the therapist's bottom line. You want to keep the patients coming back to you over and over and over and over again. You can just keep giving them a cathartic experience, and they will keep coming back to you. And I'll dare say that some religions may work this way, right? And you go throughout the day, the week, and then you go to the religion, whatever the revival thing, whatever religion you want to choose, and you have this huge cathartic experience, and then afterwards, you feel better, but then a week or two later, you need to go back and repeat this over and over and over. Very good from a marketing and business standpoint, because you keep getting business coming in. As a therapeutic thing, as performing a permanent therapeutic, giving therapeutic insight, what you were just saying about this therapy, get to the point where you don't need a therapist anymore. I am very skeptical of these things. And again, I say this as somebody who's tried these things and also tried them as a therapist and tried them as a patient. Very skeptical. So, take it with a grain of salt. I don't want to insult anybody's type of therapy they do. But I'm a little wary of this because I think the resistance this doesn't overcome the resistance. I think the catharsis becomes a resistance in a way. Take that with a grain of salt. If anybody's interested in Gestalt therapy and transactional analysis, you want to know more about that, I'm happy to talk to you and tell you a little bit about those things. They're very interesting. I do think that they're worthwhile forms of therapy. I just think, like every sort of form of therapy, this is one of the big limitations. And if I were doing Gestalt therapy or transactional analysis, I would be very aware of the cathartic aspect of it. And I think I would interpret that to the patients. I would say you're having a catharsis, but that doesn't mean that you've got to the root of your problem. In my experience, a lot of the therapists who give this stuff don't do that. And that's just my experience. So you take that with a grain of salt. Yes.
Do you think that changes at all as far as, the length of therapy with the diagnosis is, for certain things, maybe you need years and years, but maybe for other things, some short term.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've seen Gestalt and transactional analysis done both short-term and long-term, but by long-term, I mean the thing I'm telling you about, where people have a cathartic experience, they have a short run of therapy, maybe some time in even workshops and things like that. They have a short run of therapy, they have a cathartic experience, they feel better, but then a month or two later, they sign up for another workshop, they do it all over again, right? So in a sense, it's kind of long-term, it's like a disjointed long-term, right? But if you were to see a Gestalt therapist, probably be, in an office, regular office, probably be fairly short-term therapy, right? And the same with transactional analysis. I've seen transactional analysis done very long-term, but again, it's a little bit more like punctuated long-term, right? Transactional analysis basically is a stripped down version of psychodynamic therapy that's very directed. So it's really based a lot on Freudian ideas. I mean, it's really similar. And I like it for that. I mean, it's really, you can actually really educate people, a lot about unconscious process and things like that through transactional analysis. But again, there's this sort of aspect of, so I do think it can function as a short-term therapy and for symptom reduction. I think these are fine. I think they're very good things for people who want to, they want to just sort of like know themselves better. I think it can function that way. You're functioning pretty well in the world. You don't have any overall heavy-duty pathology. You just want to know yourself better. I think it's fine. I mean, again, these are things I like these kinds of therapies. I'm being a little critical of them here, but I just this is where I think the blind spot is for people who do these kind of therapies, is that they don't really want to look at this, what the catharsis is doing, because it's going to keep that patient coming back, a little later. So your bank account stays nice and flush. I'm being a little cynical about that, but I've seen that. And so I'll just, put that out there. Take it with a grain of salt, okay? And you could say some of the critique of these kinds of humanistic therapy. You could also level this at other short-term psychotherapies that are out there, okay? That are directive and cathartic in nature, okay? But again, I think if you acknowledge that the catharsis has happened, and you acknowledge that the catharsis is not the be all and end all, that feeling good now after the catharsis is not going to cure you, I think that's okay. And again, a lot of the newer therapies, I don't know about CBT, but I assume in CBT, they're not really relying on the catharsis in the sense, that they're really looking at symptom reduction. And so, the catharsis could be part of that. I don't know if there's how much catharsis in CBT. I'm sure there's some to be part of that, but it's not the major focus of the therapy, I assume, right? Is that right? Catharsis is not the major focus of CBT, right? So I think that's fine. I don't have as much problem with those as I do with humanistic therapies, because I do think in humanistic therapies, the catharsis a lot of times becomes the focus. Again, that's just my own experience. To take it with a grain of salt. Again, not meaning to criticize anybody. Anybody here have experience with any humanistic therapies? Most of you guys won't, because nobody is really training in these things. You find some MFT programs will train. Northridge's program used to train people in humanistic psychotherapy, and I don't know if they're still doing that. I think the guy who was doing it retired now, and I think now they've probably gone to CBT, because I think Diane Gerhardt, who's a master therapist, yes, it's CBT. Yeah, did you go there? Do you know about? Yeah, so it's Diane running the program. Diane Gerhardt. Who resigned?
Jill Rosani.
Jill Rosani. Okay, yeah, I've heard of her. Yeah. They used to be humanistic. There's very few. So if you want to learn to do humanistic therapy now, you've got to go to an institute, find some place that does it after you get licensed. There's very few places training in it directly. But my generation coming up, it was very common. Wherever you would have gone, you would have found people doing humanistic therapies. You would train in that. It would have been very easy, But now you have to go somewhere and do it. So it's kind of fallen out of favor. So I don't mean to be a little old-fashioned, but I just thought you guys should know something about them. And they are really interesting. They are really interesting forms of therapy. But they're trying to shortcut this work here. Resistance to defense is trying to shortcut it. And in my opinion, maybe not so much. Okay. All right. So types of resistance: repression, defense resistance, utilized to avoid anxiety. We talked about that anxiety before. Ego has a habit to hold back certain things from expression, automatically extended to the analytic situation, especially when the expression of previous repressed impulses becomes likely to occur. Patients may utilize other habitual ways of dealing with their internal problems in the sessions and be more practical to replace Freud's terms repression resistance with the term defense resistance. My dad saying this. And again, we're getting a little bit of a language semantic thing here. But you can think of all the defense mechanisms that we talked about have an aspect of resistance to them. resistance and defenses are kind of, there's a lot of overlap. So once you just, that's all you really need. Okay? When the defense is used against insight and working through, in other words, the therapeutic process, it functions as a resistance. Okay? Patients develop resistances to be influenced by the transference, counterference, reality relationship with the psychoanalyst and psychotherapist. We'll talk about, but anytime there's a defense that works against the therapy, you can think of it also as a resistance. Okay. Transference resistance derived from the expectation of a disappointment in the psychoanalyst or psychoanalytic therapist, or any kind of psychotherapist, right? Patient expresses in words or actions the resistance against the awareness of a more crucial issue. In other words, you're working with a patient and you're getting to some important issue that's starting to come up, and now suddenly the patient becomes very disappointed with you, one way to think of it is they're experiencing a negative transference. And this or negative transference now suddenly pops up because now they're resisting something going on, some insight in the therapy. An example here, a patient focused on sexual expectations from the psychotherapist or other individual, representing the psychotherapist, high visual deprivation from a mothering person working on a crucial element of their own mental problems with the psychoanalyst or psychotherapist. You'll see that sometimes your patients will fall in love with you or have sexual feelings towards you. That could be part of an Oedipal complex or something, or it could be a resistance. It could be they're doing that because they don't want to, they don't want to see the fact that you represent their, overbearing mother or something, right? So they're hiding this through some sort of transference manifestation, either negative or positive, right? And so again, that's a little hard to tease out sometimes. So again, that's why you have to sort of explore these things. Here's a case example. Linda began a psychoanalytic psychotherapy after breaking off a stormy love affair with a married man, the fifth such affair in 4 years. As her psychoanalysis or analytic therapy progressed, the origins of the behavior were revealed. During the Oedipal phase of life, Linda's mother was depressed, drank heavily, and was hospitalized from time to time. At the time of her Oedipal passage and later as a teenager, her father spoke of Linda as his second wife, took her out without her mother, and treated her in such a way that she felt an Oedipal triumph. In the second year of psychotherapy, Linda becomes infatuated with a professor at the university where I was also professor. She fills her sessions with talk about him. After collecting enough information, I explained to her that the affair was a displacement of her feelings onto me, onto her professor. And before long, the affair ends. So that's a kind of interpretation you might make, right? Linda, but you don't tell her to stop the affair, right? You're not telling her, don't do that, right? Even though, there is this kind of abstinence idea that you would have explained in the beginning of therapy, not to go off and start new relationships while you're doing the therapy. But you don't tell her to stop it. You just explain to her that, interesting, I wonder if this is some kind of, displacement of your feelings about me on this therapist, and then you see what happens. Linda then begins to dress for her sessions with great care and becomes very seductive on the couch, declares her love for me. After months, she spoke of nothing but her fantasized future with me. When I tried to connect her infatuation to the special relationship she had with her father as a child, she couldn't take it in, couldn't hear it. Her psychotherapy seemed to be at a standstill, although I maintained a psychoanalytic position and remained curious about her. And I will emphasize this word curiosity over and over and over again as a key function of what you were doing during the therapy hour. You were remaining curious about the person. And curiosity, very, very important aspect to maintain, especially when you're in the thralls of somebody's transference towards you. And by chance, Linda saw me in the theater with a woman. During the next session, she got very angry and basically felt rejected. But this external event encouraged her use of reality testing, and as a result, more routine psychotherapeutic work became possible. Okay, in other words, began to because she saw me with my wife, out in the real world, that suddenly was a reality check, right? She's living in this fantasy of her transference, but then the real world can sometimes come in and, and again, if it's brought up in the therapy again, as the therapist, I'm doing my best not to disclose who the woman was or talk about anything. I think in this case, I might have said, met with my wife or something, along those lines. And it was a reality check, right? And that sometimes can help, in this kind of thing. And again, this is something, I don't know, you guys, if you experienced this yet, have you had your patients sort of fall in love with you and this kind of thing yet? So this will come along. Yeah, some of you, yeah. So this will come along. You will have this experience. And again, this is why you need to have some of your own therapeutic stuff. So you don't really take this like they're really in love with me, and this is the love of my life, and countertransference victim. But to realize this is just an aspect of positive transference. This is an aspect of human therapy. Yes.
Is that a very common occurrence across the profession?
Common. All the time. Now, not like that they're going to want to have a sexual relationship with you, whatever, but the positive transference, I would say almost at every therapeutic encounter, if it's long enough, you have enough sessions that you're going to have positive transference. And if it continues, you'll have the negative transference. That's normal. Usually the negative transference will occur later. Positive transference will come first, and it'll be like you're doing so well, they're doing so much better, they're really getting a lot out of therapy, they'll just be saying nice things, I'm referring people to you, all these kind of things. That will go on. And then eventually, once the therapeutic alliance is established and is strong, then they'll feel a little bit more comfortable of having the negative, expressing the negative transference stuff. Right? So that will be, I'm sure as an attorney, you get the same thing. I'm sure attorneys get, I see my wife, she's an attorney. I see the positive negative transference come up as for her, with long-term clients that she deals with over and over again. Most of whom are crazy, by the way, because that's who's going to be suing each other, right? Crazy people, right? I mean, or they get sued, but yeah, you see it in a lot of professions.
It's kind of what made me think about it. It's like, you do sort of see anytime you have something for in a position of power.
Yeah.
Coming in with a problem, my husband is, maybe say all these terrible things.
Yeah.
Here's a person who's like, you have a job. It's like you're not him. So
yeah,
I think that's pretty natural. But it always, to me, it was pretty easy because I learned when I was in the Army, they always used to say, you don't avoid people party, you avoid even the appearance of the party.
Right.
Which means for a situation like this, like you would run.
Yeah.
See ya. But I understand like that's a central part of this person's issues. That's not helpful to them, which strikes me as, sort of dangerous. I mean, it's a tightrope that you gotta walk.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is why it's really important that everybody get their own therapy, work out your own issues. Look, we are relationship making machines, we are relationship making animals. We're primates, primates function in societies, small societies where they make relationships, right? Now, I would say the driving things, the Eros and Thanatos are driving that relationship thing, but we essentially, if you put two people on a deserted island, for a long enough period of time, they will form some kind of relationship, and usually will go through this positive and negative phase, and eventually it will even out into something, and this is what we do as human beings. And so this being in a therapeutic relationship is no different than being in any other kind of relationship. It has its ups and downs. It has its positives and negatives, and eventually it has, if you're lucky and you have some skill, an alliance will form. Right? The important thing to remember is different than a love relationship, and it's different than a friendship. Right? And the love relationship, everybody knows, you don't sleep with your clients, it's always going to be a lose license. I showed you the word psychology stuff. It's bad. It's bad for the client, inevitably bad for the client. The friendship one is a little harder because a lot of people treat their therapist like a friend, right? And you can be friendly with your therapist. As a therapist, you can be friendly with your clients. You can like your clients, and hopefully you do like your clients. Well, hopefully we're all like Carl Rogers, and we can have unconditional positive regard for people that we see, right? But you don't have a friendship in the sense of the friendship you have with your friends in your personal life. It's a different kind of relationship. So what we've done is we've carved out this ritual, right? It doesn't matter what kind of therapy you're doing, carve out this ritual where you meet with a person for 50 minutes, and you're sitting with them and you establish a relationship with them. But this relationship has some special parameters and boundaries and things like that. that allow you to do the work. So it's kind of I think of it's kind of a ritualized form of friendliness that characterizes the relationship. But it is a different kind of relationship than you have with other people in your life. Now, other therapists may disagree with me in that. Different types of therapists may disagree, but it's not a friendship. You know, it's different. Yes.
Would you say that sort of telehealth and kind of like change this dynamic? And why I say this is because I feel like with my in-person clients and my telehealth clients, there's like more moving towards friendship with telehealth just because they have access. Like I have a teenager that last night she's like, I'm selling a costume, let me show you. And she put her costume, like, the costume I'm selling. And like that's not possible in person. And so that's why I was feeling like is this appropriate? Or like if it's
Right.
excited about it.
That's very interesting. So there's two things that I'm thinking when you're saying this. First of all, is that the telehealth thing now, people show up and you see them into their house and you see them in there. It's like going to their home and doing therapy with them. And so they show up in their pajamas or whatever they're wearing, and so you see this whole other kind of you're outside the little circumscribed, ritual space of the therapy room, right? And so, yeah, I think that's different. My feeling is that all has to be worked out. I think we're in the process now of working all that out, and how therapy is going to change because of television. I think, look, I have the writings on the wall. I think, we're all going to be doing telework. I told you guys my Jungian analyst teachers, both of them, they do most of their practice now in telework. Also because they're weird and they travel all the time. I don't even know about their travel thing. They're always traveling. So they're doing telehealth all the time. And they're Jungian analysts. Jungian analysts, they're really into the the really weird, cool, unconscious archetype of it. They're doing telehealth stuff, teletherapy. And so everybody's doing it. I think there's something to be said about maintaining the ritual space and coming into the ritual space and it being separate from the world. It's almost like, I don't know anybody here read Mercier Eliot. We talked about the axis mundi, right? The center of the world, that you go into this sort of ritual space, and you can see this in lots of religions. You go into this ritual space, and in that space, some kind of transformation can happen. It doesn't necessarily happen when you're out in the real world. Right? I think the therapy office, and I'm going to talk about the therapy office in a minute. I think that is really, really cool and something we don't want to lose as psychotherapists. Also, the other thing is when somebody comes in and they're in the office and there you see not only verbally seeing them, you're seeing the head, you're seeing the whole body, you're seeing body language, you're getting a sense of what's going on. You may sense, you may unconsciously sense smell and other things that tell you clues about the person in that ritual therapy room that you don't get in telehealth. So I do think, I think all things being equal, I think I would prefer that the ritual of the therapy space happen. I'd rather see people in person because I think that ritual is important. And also that's how I would train. I'm comfortable with that ritual in that thing. And there's lots of richness that can happen in that special room. It's like when you go to church, right? Anybody here Catholic? Anybody Catholic here? Catholic? So if you've been in the Catholic Church, you've ever gone to one of the great churches. I went to the church in Assisi in Italy. I was in Italy for a while. And you go in there, and it's like you are in a different space there. It is like very, very, and that's where the magic of the ritual of the Mass can occur. And it's different than if you're just doing it out in the field somewhere. There's a power to it that contains space. And I recommend reading Mercier Eliot, a very beautiful writer. Talks about the sort of sacred space and this kind of stuff. So I think the therapy office has that, and I think we lose that. So that's the advantage. The obviously, disadvantage is that it's harder for people to get into therapy. It's costs more money. You have to rent a space. You got to furnish it, all those kind of things. So telehealth it's here to stay. It's not going away. So my feeling is a lot of therapists are doing a little bit of both now, and I think you will be able to ascertain probably in your practices. Who needs to come in for the ritual in the space and who can benefit from the telehealth, and even during different aspects of the therapy may benefit by coming in doing in person for a while and then going back to teletherapy. All that is still being worked out. And again, this whole idea of, does it make the person, does it increase the friendship? Are you more like a friend doing telehealth? That's different. Now, so that's one thing. And I have no answer for you. I think that's all, like you guys, your generation will be working that out. Your generation of therapists will be working that out. And the rest of us will be kind of, the old codgers will be looking and see what you're doing. So, we should go back to the therapy office. We say it in the book, we say, you should really, we prefer that we do therapy in the office, right? I think that's important, but I do recognize that telehealth is here to stay. All my therapist friends are all doing telehealth to some degree, and they don't have to. They can see people in the office. It's convenient. So I think that's here to stay. The California Board of Psychology is coming up with all sorts of rules now and sending these things about telehealth, and I'm sure you're going to learn all that, through your license exam, and they'll have all sorts of things in there. The other thing is about the friendship is you're dealing with kids and adolescents, and that's different. And again, I'm not really experienced doing therapy with kids, but with kids, I think you can develop more of a friendship because built into that friendship is the fact that you're an adult. And so that transferential relationship is there immediately because you're an adult, they're a kid, they're going to be transferring to you all sorts of things if they're on their authority figures about their parents onto you. And I think that the friendship probably is less intrusive than it would be with two adults, right? Coming into therapy. So I think, and the child therapists I know tend to be more friendly. They tend to make a little bit more like making friends with kids. And also the kids, the concrete hasn't set, so they can be a little more directed. That's the other thing I've seen. A little more directed. Not just sort of laying back, a little less neutrality. Now, again, I take it with a grain of salt what I'm saying. It's just my perception. And you should get a child, psychodynamic therapist in here to talk about it. If I can find one, I'll bring them in and talk about it. Because my experience with kids is just deeply behavior. And that is really pretty limited, and that's a whole story, which is a great story over a beer to tell sometime why I work with kids. Has to do with transference and all these things I'm talking about, but it was with the boss of my unit. We had all sorts of negative transference for them. Very interesting. But my work with kids is just ABA. I never did any psychotherapy. So if I can find somebody, I'll ask them that. I'll ask them that question. Is it okay to be more friendly with the kids and make more friends with the kids? The kids want to show you what they're dressed, they want, and that seems to me to be okay. But you will have your regular clients do that too, buddy. So I can tell you, I've got lots of stories about that. Your regular clients want you to render an opinion about what they're doing, and then you have to talk about that. So that's what you say to them,
I'm no expert on restricting that. Whole trusting with kids is very important. I would say more so than adults.
Yeah.
They have to establishing a relationship where there's at least a semblance of respect, not somewhat of a friendship kind of. But very important. But yes, and what's super nice about it is a lot of things have respect. Like you can be way more directed.
Yeah.
With the super, which I've but it's not.
Yeah. But the kids too are all automatically going to see you as an adult, I'm sure, a parent figure, right? Yeah. So it's going to be baked in, right?
So they have to trust.
Yeah.
If they do not trust you.
That's true though with regular therapy. This is what I'm talking to you guys about, the therapeutic alliance. For kids, it seems a little more, for me, it seems a little more obvious that you need to develop that, but you need to develop that also with your adult clients who are going to be a little more, not immediately. The transference is going to be so immediately aware. It's not a baked in relationship between an adult and a child, right? It's you're going to come in and it's going to seem like two equals, but it's very quickly not going to be. And so again, I think with adults it's a little trickier to establish that and maintain the condition, right? But yeah, that's interesting. So I'm interested in hearing about your guys' experience with kids. I think that's an interesting thing. I'll find somebody who works with kids. I want to ask them about this, an analyst or somebody who works with kids. I'll ask them about this. I'm really curious about this now. Okay, so that's one case. Here's another one. Or we can think about this. you can figure out what's going on here. Linda, difficulty acknowledging guilt about replacing her mother as her father's second wife, losing her mother's love in the process made up the primary source of resistance, right? In reality, Linda had a very troubled and alcoholic mother who could not provide good mothering for little Linda. So as long as Linda preoccupied herself with the love of her father, lover, psychoanalyst, whoever it might be, she could keep the painful feelings associated with depriving the mother at bay. The mother depriving mother at bay. In other words, she develops an exaggerated, erotic transference. And this steers clear of her wish to find a good mother, okay, and her dread that such a person might not exist. The latter is true, she'd be devastated and enraged. And so she uses the erotic transference to resist against having to come, to come to the depth, to the realization about her relationship with her mother. Okay. So the father relationship sort of covers that over, right? The transference resistance covers that over. Okay. And it's only after that develops and it gets, resolved to some degree, can she come and work on the mother problems, which are really underlying everything. Does that make sense? Yeah. And I have a case too that's very similar. Yeah, here's the case. So this is a case of mine. This was a very interesting case, very similar in a way, right? So I was doing group therapy, and a woman, we'll call her Chloe, and she started to develop a very erotic transference to me. And this is in the context of psychoanalytic psychotherapy group, which consisted of 7 women, 7 or 8, depending, and a male and a female therapist. I was the male therapist, and I had a female co-therapist, a woman who was much older than me, and we were the co-therapists. A lot of times, psychoanalytic psychotherapy groups have a male and female therapist. Very good. Or 2 therapists, okay, and 1 therapist. But the male-female therapist is kind of an ideal situation, right? During the second year of therapy, Chloe began to come to group therapy sessions wearing revealing clothing, sit directly in front of me. I became curious about this behavior and felt that it had something to do with her father, right? That's the typical thing you would think of, right? During the therapy sessions, Chloe was able to relate that her father often traveled for business, so when he was home, he paid little attention to her. She was also married to a man who worked as a traveling salesperson and was away from home a lot of times, leaving Chloe to care for her 2 sons. By the way, side note here, my co-therapist was seeing the husband in individual therapy. And what he did when he was traveling away from home was, he was going to see prostitutes all the time, and he was doing crack, all sorts of stuff, which my co-therapist related to me, which, as we talk about our cases, I didn't want to hear that because I have to work with the woman, right? And so this is one of those tricky things. If we do group therapy with somebody and you're also seeing people individually, it's very tough because you have all these secrets, all these confidentialities you have to meet. And I did not think it was a good idea for her to tell me stuff. At one point I said, no, don't tell me. I don't know about the husband. That's not, you deal with him. But when she was in the therapy session with the woman, she had to keep all the information about the husband compartmentalized and be very, very careful not to let that slip out. Very tough to do. She was very experienced. She was very experienced therapist, been practicing 40 years or something when I was working with her. And she was able to do that. I was in awe. And I thought to myself, I will not do that because I did not have that experience. I would worry that I would something would slip out, And unfortunately, I knew about the husband at this time, which was not helpful. But it did make me think that something was going on. The husband and the father were very similar this way. And it made me wonder about what the father had been doing when he was away from home. And probably put me a little bit on that path, that wrong path there. Yes.
I know that I talked about this, like earlier, about this, but I think it's kind of something that I think I can come up with cases time and again. So often you see like the relationship with parents, or sorry, the client had with the parent. You see that echoed in our romantic relationship.
Yes. All of us.
I'm not saying like every person is like, yes, like, oh yeah, my relationship with my dad was just now my relationship with the father I have or that way.
Yeah.
But it does seem to come up quite often.
All the time. All the time. And even if the person is not your father or your mother, you will project onto them qualities of your father and mother. That's the transference. So that's what I was talking about when I talk about transference. And I'm saying everybody has transference with everybody, right? It's just, it's again, part of our human condition that we just project this transference out onto everybody. And we go, and then you find people where their transference hooks into yours. And if that can be a positive thing, then you can develop a positive relationship. It can also become problematic. You picking the person for the wrong reason, because you're just projecting onto them, and that's not really who they are. This is why a lot of relationships break up, right? You meet somebody, your transference, you're projecting some idealized thing onto each other, and then when you find out what the real person is like, now you're disappointed, right? It didn't resolve whatever need you had initially from your transference, and so that's when people break up.
So what does that?
Repetition compulsion, right? Because you're trying to keep getting mastery over the same thing, right? You have this thing, it didn't resolve in your childhood properly, and so you keep playing it out over and over and over and over again until you try to resolve it. So it's very common, by the way. I didn't talk about repetition compulsion a lot, but it's very common. You'll see this all the time.
You think it's around who you fix it. So
Yeah, I mean, eventually, again, this kind of thing, resolving the transference, interpretation, when the person has an established alliance with you therapeutically, they can start to hear the interpretation of that. It's interesting that, this time with your boss, it's interesting. It's similar like the last time what's going on. And again, getting the person, you remain curious about it, and getting the client to remain curious about it, right? And eventually they'll start to understand it. Repetition compulsion is one of the things that often I found as a therapist that people they start to get it pretty quick. They start realizing they're doing something wrong. Because a lot of times people are coming into you because they keep doing the same thing over and over and over again, maladaptive thing, and it's not working for them, right? Now, if you want to be behavioral about it, you can say repetition compulsion comes because that's the pattern they've established to be reinforced for something, right? And then what you're going to do is trying to reinforce them for something different, for not doing that, right? Fading that behavior away if you want to be ABing about it. Which I think you could make a case, you could talk about that. But repetition compulsion happens all the time. And there's lots of different versions of it. I don't know if we'll have time to get into it. We'll talk a little bit about it as we go through the class this semester. But yeah, very important thing to think about. All right, so let me get back to this case here. So anyway, she had this husband and this father. She's often at home taking care of her two sons. She would arrive in group therapy outfits. Group therapy sessions were very revealing outfits, and it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. She started showing up without a bra. She'd sit down in front of me. Her nipples would become erect, and they stay the way for the whole session. Then she'd leave, and this was very interesting. And so I just remained curious about this. Very interesting. And I thought it had something to do with the father, And she even started discussing how she felt about her father during her childhood. So I thought this was rooted in this father relationship. But some clues started to come out that made me think that this might be some form of resistance. At one point, Chloe mentioned her sons and how she was worried they might be unhealthy because they weren't getting enough nourishment. And that was kind of very interesting. Like, why is this coming up? My female co-therapist tried to explore this with Chloe. She became very angry and only wanted to talk to me during the group session. Very angry, only wanted to talk to me in group session. And that was very interesting. And I had a little intuition, and I asked her if she might be worried that she might be a bad mother. And at this point, she broke down and started crying in the middle of the session. Broke down, started crying. She revealed that while her father was away, her mother would go out at night, leave the kids, her and her sisters, her siblings, leave them at home, and without giving them dinner or anything, go out and party and carouse. And I assume the implication was, sleep with other men, this kind of stuff. Her mother would dress in revealing outfits, especially low-cut clothing, especially stuff that would reveal her ample bosom, right? And so I started thinking, this behavior of her not wearing a bra coming in. Now I'm starting to think, this is related to the mother, right? Chloe has now realized she carried a lot of anger toward her mother, who put her own pleasure ahead of taking care of her own children. Her coming to therapy sessions, displaying her nipples was a way of remembering her childhood mother, as well as expressing her unconscious wish to be a good mother and nourish her children. Right. So display of her breasts was not really about trying to, the resistance was that this was some sort of erotic transference toward me, but actually what it was her trying to display that she wanted to be a good mother. She wanted to nourish her children, right? Because remember, guys especially, what are breasts for? They're for feeding babies, right? They're not necessarily sexual objects that all men think that they are. They're for feeding babies. So what she was really talking about was about feeding her children, nourishing her children. Okay? And then we began to explore this relationship about her mother, and that the therapy really took a jump. I mean, it just leaps and bounds suddenly. She started having a lot of insight, and the erotic behavior stopped. Literally, with next session, it was, she came in, she was normal. Talk about the mother. Okay? So that's something I wanted to talk about. It was a very good case. It was a very, very, very good case. This is another one who, after, I think she was in therapy, probably 2-3 years group therapy, and was another one who would very, very smart woman, would just, before I could make an interpretation, would interpret to herself. She got it, and terminated. By the time we terminated, she was able to make the interpretations, herself. She didn't need a therapist anymore. Very, very, very good case here. I put this up here, by the way, A Dangerous Method. You guys see this movie? All homework. We'll watch this movie now. This is about Jung and Freud and Jung's relationship with Sabrina Spielberg, his patient who he slept with, who later went to become an analyst herself, and unfortunately was taken by the Nazis and thrown into a concentration camp and killed. Very unfortunate. But this is a movie about their relationship. Michael Fassbender plays Jung. I think not the Jung I see in my head. Viggo Mortensen plays Freud, the best depiction of Freud I've ever seen. Brilliant. I mean, this is the guy who was in the Lord of the Rings, right? Playing Aragorn. Now he's playing Freud. Brilliant, brilliant depiction of Freud. Keira Knightley. I was going to mention Keira Knightley, who does the most awesome, weird, erotic, sadomasochistic face solos throughout the movie. So you can watch that as Jung is spanking her. I don't know how much of that is exactly, it might be really Hollywoodized, but it's a good movie, and it shows you the dangers of sleeping with your patients and succumbing to erotic transference, which Jung unfortunately did. And she wasn't the only one. He slept with patients. And Freud was saying, that's such a good idea. And Jung was like, it's fine. It'll be fine, right? Not so good. Luckily, in her case, she decided to become an analyst on her own. She really was able to pull herself out of this relationship with Jung and become an analyst. Jung's later affair with a woman named, I'm blanking on it. He had a later affair with a woman who became basically almost like a second wife, like a mistress. So that he would go off he built this tower by hand in his property. He'd go off in the tower and have a dalliance with her in the afternoon and bring her down to the house, the main house for the wife, and his 5 kids would be having dinner and bring her in for dinner, and the wife became so upset that she tried to, her and the mistress would go into therapy together to try to resolve what's going on. She didn't divorce him, which was pretty amazing. And she would write Freud letters and say, what do I do about this guy? It's a wolf to read. Tony Wolf, that was the other mistress, Tony Wolf. Such a womanizer. What do I do about him? Freud would be like, I don't know what to tell you. Very interesting movie. So this is part of the movie. You can see it. So I definitely recommend watching this. Pretty good. Okay. All right. Gain of illness resistance. This takes place when the patient maintains his or her symptoms because they satisfy some internal demands or striving. This is the opposite of the flight into health. So it's not only just flight into health, but it's also like you can become sick, right? So it's kind of the same idea. And here's the case example: Paul, mid-20s, psychoanalytic therapy because he had a feeling of not being able to move his right arm properly. He went to all the doctors. They said, there's nothing wrong with you, and you better see a psychologist. And the following story came up very early in his treatment. He was working in his rich uncle's grocery store, while having an ambivalent relationship with his uncle who owned the store and represented the father figure to him. Had a full problem. He was anxiously engaged in unconscious competition with the older man. And again, this is what you see, the hallmark of Oedipal issues is competition. Okay. He fantasized about making love to the uncle's secretary, who was in Paul's mind was his uncle's mistress. One day he had an argument with his uncle and thought about hitting him and kicking him. While he was in this angry mood, a heavy box fell on him, knocking him unconscious. While the doctor reassured him he had suffered no lasting physical damage, he continued to suffer from the blow he'd sustained. His symptoms of pain and other accident-related complaints wanted considerable attention from his uncle, while the secretary pampered him. So again, he's getting attention gained because he's something, he had some kind of illness or injury, right? And that becomes a resistance to his therapy. Okay. They continued to exist for years. And in psychotherapy, he revealed he was really resistant to giving up the symptom. Okay, because he gets so much out of it, gets so much gain out of having, my arm doesn't work, And this also helps satisfy his punitive superego, because he perceived that the blow from the box was punishment for his feelings toward his uncle. Okay, and the guilt from that. So staying ill kept him from knowing his death wishes toward his uncle's father. Moreover, the symptom wanted him in a dependent position, which he got considerable attention from the uncle and from this forbidden woman, the secretary, all without fear of retaliation because of the accident. So he was, once he becomes aware of the reason for remaining injured, he starts to perceive the therapist as the castrating father, Oedipal father figure in the transference, and he's then slowly able to resolve it, right? But again, initially he has this gain of illness transference. That makes sense? So sometimes you'll see this. People don't want to give up their symptoms. You'll hear the popular vernacular, somebody's in love with their pain, right? They're in love with their problems, right? You'll see sometimes people coming into therapy with this kind of stuff. Repetition compulsion, this is what we were just talking about, or refers to repeating traumatic events to try to gain mastery over them. Noting this compulsion to repeat, Freud theorized that some demonic force opposing the pleasure principle came to attribute repetition compulsion to mental operations more primitive in a biological evolutionary sense than those normally directed by pleasure displeasure. And this is where he develops the so-called death instinct, the thanatos. I told you we're not going to go into the details of death instinct, but really this is what ends up being aggression, right? I told you it was pleasure and aggression. This is the aggression. This is thanatos. Okay? This is where Freud comes up with it, thinking about repetition compulsion. Okay. So repetition compulsion plays in resistance during psychoanalysis and also psychoanalytic therapy, and also you see this in any kind of therapy. The tendency to repeat can be understood as a force opposing the patient's attempt to leave behind the pathological patterns after their meanings are interpreted, understood, and owned. Okay, in the clinical setting, repetition compulsion most clearly noticed when a childhood trauma and the patient's habitual response to it continue to repeat sometime after the patient at least has some awareness of it. Okay, very common pattern. You'll see this all the time. Also the attempt to gain mastery over the past situation. Keep repeating it till you get mastery over it, even though you know about this. Sometimes repetition can be related to anniversaries and other triggering events as well. So anniversaries is very important to pay attention to. Something happens, usually a car accident, and when the anniversary of it comes up again, as a therapist, you kind of need to be a little bit of that. So these happen all the time. They're very interesting. You might even be able to think in your own life where you have repetition patterns. So when I'll give you an example of my own life. When I was a kid, I was in a pretty bad car accident, pretty traumatic. And when I grew up, I became interested in cars and driving cars fast, and thought about going to the racetrack and learning how to drive race cars. I never did it, but I thought about it, and I became obsessed with buying sports cars and things like that, and cars that are really fast, other things like that. And if I think about that's a little bit of repetition culture. Keep trying, and I'm a person who I go through a lot of. I buy cars all the time. Buy them for a year, get another one. Constantly going, repeating this idea of getting cars until I find one that's perfect, right? The idea is eventually I'll find the perfect one. Perfect for a while, and then I'm bored with it. I go to another one. this is probably repetition compulsion from my childhood car accident. That's my guess. You know, and so again, you know, like some awareness of it, but it's not like I don't keep doing it, right? Do it. You know? So that's a pretty mild example, but you'll see in your patients, you know, more serious examples of this kind of thing. Yeah. Yes.
Would it be, would you think the repetition is one from childhood? It wouldn't be something that happened later in life.
It could be later in life, but usually it's from childhood. If it happens later in life, the later in life thing sometimes can be also traced back to something in childhood. That's a kind of bias we have in psychodynamic therapy, but it could be something later in life. But generally, the later in life thing will at least symbolically represent something from earlier on. Okay. And this is the myth of Sisyphus. You know, how you keep having to roll the rock up the hill, and just before you get to the top, it would roll back down. And you have to go over again and repeat the pattern. Albert Camus, the great existentialist writer, wrote a great essay about the myth of Sisyphus. I highly recommend you reading that. But this is a good example from mythology of this repetition compulsion pattern, right? And the idea is that in psychotherapy, people, it's almost like a form of self-psychotherapy. You try to repeat the pattern and get mastery over it, and you do it over and over again. But usually people do not ever really get mastery over it. You know, so they might get mastery over whatever the task is they're doing, but they never get mastery over the original thing because it's unconscious, right? They don't get mastery over it until it's really interpreted to them, until it really sinks in. And so again, you'll see repetition all the time. Very, very, very common, right? Very, very common. Here's a case example, and I think we're going to run out of time here. So maybe I'll skip this case. I'll let you guys read this one, and maybe we should take a break. This is a good example, though. It's a long one. Why don't I'll let you guys read that, and you can ask me questions about it later. I want to get through this. We have a little bit more to get through today too, so I'm worrying about time. So why don't we take a break? Let's take you guys ready for a break? About a 10-minute break, and then we'll get back on this. Okay. I wrote a lot about this one because, as you were saying, this is very common. So.
We'll just
See a question about something that happened the other day with a client.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, this sounds like some psychoanalysis. So I've been working with this lady for, I guess it's probably like 4 months now or something. And I know she had a very rough upbringing with her family. And her dad was quasi sexually abusive, like, it's all horrible, but long story short, the other day she's telling me something and it was way off the charts of anything she said before. She said, I was always trying to get my dad's attention and his affection. And she said, that's why I have a curved spine. And I was like, curved spine. I didn't have to say anything. She heard was she kept talking. And she said, when I was a kid, she said that if we had a chair, I could take it like a recliner or something. And she says, I used to curl myself in the chair because my dad would always pet the cat. So I wanted to keep a cat. So I curled up in the chair like the cat. And apparently she did it so much that her back is
got scoliosis from that.
Yeah. And I was like, now that's some Freudian shit right there.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I was like, signing up for 10 more years right now, but
yeah, that's interesting. Well, I mean, I think that's worth playing out. So the thing that I would be watching out for would be to see how she replays out her feelings for her dad with you. Okay, is she going to want you to give her that attention? Is she going to want to be the cat that she wants you to pet her? And she's going to, do something, in the therapy sessions where she wants that kind of attention from you. I would be curious about that. I think that's, that could be like, and also, is she doing that, in her life? How is she playing out that relationship in areas of her life? She's seeking out men for attention, like, or bosses or authority figures, that kind of thing.
I think so.
I'd be curious about that,
I think so.
because if that kind of strong of a pattern probably is going to be influencing other things she's doing,
Sort of like reenacting that relationship.
Yeah.
Throughout her life.
Yeah.
Okay, I see.
And then the other thing, the hidden thing to wonder about a lot of times, again, like this case I just showed you, is what's going on with the mother during this stuff. What are her feelings about her mother? She's talking about her father and pulling up and sharing, being fed by her. What's going on with the mother? What was the mother doing? What are her feelings about her mother?
Lots of feelings about her mom. Her mom passed away upon it. She was died. And mom had wasn't supposed to have kids. The doctor said it would be too much, whatever was going on with her physically. I think her heart or something like that. And so when my client was born, I want to say she has like 3 other siblings. Maybe it's 4, but it's at least 3. But they basically looked at her like, "You're the straw that broke the camel's back.
You killed mom."
Mom. And she's sort of grown up her whole life, sort of like her family, like condemning her. And she sort of has these views of like, she is really like, and she said this several times, like she feels worthless.
Yeah.
She's like, I have the right to exist as long as I can serve someone else.
Right.
I have the right to exist. Wow.
Yeah. So that's gonna play out, definitely, that's gonna be a big issue. My dad has a case like that, actually, of a girl whose mother died when she was really young, and then she has a stepmother. There's a stepmother who comes along and then reinforces a lot of those feelings there. I would be paying attention to that. How is that now playing out in her life? And there's a pattern there, right? So the father pattern may be related, it may be a resistance, you don't really know, but this pattern of her of these feelings about guilt over her mother, and then what's she doing with that? What's going on there? Is she repressed it? Is it playing out? Is she doing things to herself? I would be very curious about that. And so you've got 2 main patterns that you're looking at, right? So again, you want to see how those things play out in her life with her other relationships, but also how they play out with you, right? Because just because you're a man doesn't mean that she won't play out feelings of guilt about the mother or whatever with you. She'll play out the father stuff with you. So I would be curious about how that stuff is coming out in the therapy sessions. I don't know if she talks to you about her dreams. If
Never asked about that. It always seems like I almost feel like taboo asking about that just for the whole CBT perspective. But maybe I should ask about that.
Well, I mean, it's curious, because you'll see these patterns in the dreams. These would come out in dreams. You don't have to ask her about her dreams specifically. Oh, do you have a dream? You could say something like, do you ever dream? Do you ever remember your dreams? And just kind of see if then she comes up with something, and it may not be right away. It may be further down the line or whatever. But yeah, those are going to be the patterns, right? There's going to be a lot of guilt going on, and then the question would be, the mother's gone. Is there another mothering person who comes in? This father remarries, or somebody else who comes in and takes the role of the mother?
She basically, what she did, she married her current husband. She's been married for like 40-some years, but he is 20 years her senior. She's 62, so he's 82. Yeah. And he's going through like dementia now, and she's like basically his caretaker. Yeah. So I think basically we've had like 25 sessions. I think basically for the last 4 years, she was able to use her husband as like a pseudo father in a way. Like she was able to serve him and not even think about her own. And now that he's sort of like, I mean, he's still alive, but mentally he's not the same. she's like in crisis, like, who am I, sort of thing, you know?
Yeah. So one question to be asked her would be like, now that you have to take on this caretaker role for this guy, you know, what does it feel like you to be a caretaker that your mother, you know, never was, you know?
Oh.
And because this is going to be something that I could see that causing her a crisis, right?
Mm.
She's going to now be like, you know, I have to be this person who I feel guilty about basically killing, you know? And so that I could see that causing all sorts of problems,
Interesting.
you know?
Thought about that, yeah.
And maybe stuff will come out about who she identifies as a mothering figure, who was her, you know, maybe she had another role model, maybe she never figured that out, you know, what's going on with that stuff. I mean, I would be interested in that. And then again, I would be very curious about the transference to you, you know, how she is perceiving you, you know, vis-a-vis all this stuff, you know. But, you know, there's going to be some guilt. I mean, obviously, there's a sort of hidden thing that she killed her mother, and that sometimes that comes out symbolically in some sort of ways that she needs to like suffer in some way for that, you know, that there's some penance that she has to do. That's, I think, my dad's case. There was
Very
some
right on.
girl felt there was some penance that she had to do, and it came out to these odd, you know, symbolic ways, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, no, that's totally dead on. She does not know how to like have fun. We've talked about, like, I was like, why don't you go out, you know, finances permitting, go do something nice for yourself.
Yeah.
And she's told me how she can't. She's just like, I can't do it.
Yeah.
And then she came in last week, and it's telehealth, but she's like, yeah, I sent the $200 care package to like the Los Angeles LSPCA or whatever it's called. And
Yeah.
so she'll spend it on that, but she won't spend it on herself.
Yeah, so you can ask her about that. You know, why the SPCA? What's the money for? Is it for preventing the animals from being put down? Be my guess. You know,
Yeah.
She's been want to, like, you know, somehow the animals represent her mother in some way. She doesn't want to kill. You know, she's trying to prevent the killing going on in some way of these creatures. And you know, I mean, there's probably a lot of symbolic content going on there. So I would say the thing is just make sure, you know, again, I'll reemphasize the word. Just be curious about symbolically what's going on. I mean, this is the kind of thing, you know, where I think, you know, CBT isn't going to be helpful because you're just dealing with the sort of cognitive function,
right?
You know, but the underlying stuff is you want to get to the emotional stuff that underlies the cognition, right? Why is she having these thoughts? What's propelling these thoughts? What's motivating these thoughts, right?
Right.
Guilt, you know, feeling that she killed her mother at some very unconscious level. You know, it's not like you can't just go to her and say, oh, you know, you feel like you killed your mother, so that's why, you know, that was, you know, but getting her to experience where that is in the unconscious, you know, coming up.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I agree when I see stuff like that. I actually have another client that's sort of has like some deep issues like that too. I just feel like the whole CBT thing is just, I mean, I think it works wonderful for a lot of, but there's some that it just.
Well, I mean, you know, I mean, everything has, you know, no form of psychotherapy is good for everything, right? Every psychotherapy has its sort of thing that it's good at. And, you know, the thing is, you know, I think my bias, if you will, is that I think we all need to be flexible and be able to pivot from one to the other, right? I mean, and I think CBT is very good for that. I think it's a very good way to get people into therapy, deal with some symptomatic issues. And then if they have other stuff going on, underlying things, then, you know, you can pivot and, you know, get into more of a psychodynamic thing, you know, maybe a little bit more long term. Yeah. You know, I mean, you know, I know some of these people are being supervised by Dr. Schwartz, you know, you could, you know, this would be a good case, you know, to be supervised by somebody like that. I don't know how it works here, but, you know, that's the kind of, I mean, he would be good for that kind of thing, you know? Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Next time if they pass it, that's probably good. Like, I think because we're doing really good as far as our, you know, relationship goes.
Yeah.
But I think the next time probably would do better to have something a bit more psychodynamic or, you know. Yeah. I mean, you want to be able to pivot. I mean, is it set up so you can keep her as a client and keep seeing her? Is it like this? You have to give up seeing her after a certain point because it's part of your placement or whatever? I mean, the only limitation is that, you know, once I leave the clinic, because we're only here for a year as far as in the CLU clinic. So once I'm gone, then that's it.
And you can't say, you know, we could work together later on or something like that?
I
Is
don't
that-
think so. I
Yeah,
don't think they allow that. I mean, I
Yeah.
could ask. I wouldn't mind. I mean, I'd be happy to keep.
I think it's too bad. I mean, it sounds like this is a really good beginning to kind of more of a long-term therapy.
It
It'd
is.
be great if you could follow it and get some supervision, for it. It'd be fantastic. It's a really interesting kind of case.
It really is.
You know?
And she's totally seeing me as like a pseudo replacement for her husband now who's sick.
Yeah.
And I mean that in the sense of like, for whatever, and she requested a male therapist.
Yeah,
It's not anything I'm doing necessarily,
Yeah.
but that's, so I can clearly see that very much have to pry as far as like, do you agree with this? Do you like this? Do you not like that? Because she's very prone to saying, oh yeah, you're right, or I agree. And
Yeah.
sort of take that with a grain of
yeah,
salt.
yeah, that's
know?
good. Yeah, of course, she's going to be overly compliant. Yes,
Yeah, yeah.
absolutely, right?
So,
And that the guilt feelings feed into that, and the stuff with the father feeds into that. And yeah. A lot of interesting things you could explore with her.
yeah.
But it's too bad, I mean, this is the problem with, the way your training is set up and everything, that you can't stick with this person for a while longer.
That's true. I mean, I guess the one good part is that she's not really well off, and it's $17 a session, so there's
Yeah.
that. So,
Well, but that's good. Yeah, I mean, that's good that you can see people low cost and, I mean,
yeah.
she's paying something is very good.
Yeah. So, I mean, she's a great like first client to have. It's like, she likes to talk and she makes it easy for me, but there's a lot there.
So another thing is, if you have time to do it or inclination, I would recommend, if I was supervising you in this case,
Yeah.
I would have you write down when you're done with the session, write down everything, and then what'll happen is sometimes the patterns will come up when you call stuff. They didn't come up. Rather than taking notes during the session.
Yeah. Right down after.
That's how I was trained. It's like totally old school. After, no notes during the session. Afterwards, write down everything that happened. Right. And then you go back through it and start seeing patterns. Oh, that was kind of like, she said this kind of thing. Try a little bit of that. You don't have to do hardcore thing.
Yeah, she certainly gives me enough material.
Yeah. Also, the verboseness is a defense. That can be very defensive. She wants to keep talking. That's also a defensive thing, right?
I never thought of it that way. But you're right. She's like a rocket. She'll just go into like. Finally, I got to like session like like more of like I can't just let her just talk forever. So like I got to start understanding. So but yeah, you're right. She just be talking.
Well, you might again be curious about that. You might say to her something like that. Just kind of notice you talk for the whole session. And I'm just wondering,
why that is,
how that feels to you, and just gently explore. Don't say shut up and let me talk. Just gently explore. Wonder what's going on with why. Makes you. We can say, I noticed you talked a lot about this last couple of sessions, and just sort of gently, poke a little bit. And see what's going on.
I like that. It's very helpful to hear you put it in such direct terms, like ask these questions.
Yeah.
We always think of psycho, like, oh, that's like something that takes like 50 years to learn or something. It's like, we're like, ask these questions. That's very helpful.
What takes to learn is actually not doing anything. That's the hardest thing. Is not doing anything. Just sitting there and letting the person talk. If you were in psychoanalysis, you wouldn't say nothing. You would just let her talk. After a year, you might say, you talk a lot. I mean, you just let them organically talk up. Therapy, you can ask, be a little curious about it. You talked a lot in the last couple of sessions. I just wondering how you're feeling when you're not for so long, And if you really feel a good therapeutic alliance, you might venture upon saying, I noticed you talked a lot like the last couple of sessions. I was just wondering if maybe you felt you needed to talk because you were nervous about stage. A little bit of pushing, not too much.
Yeah, just probing a bit.
Probing a little bit. Very deep,
Yeah, process.
Because Because you're not seeing her for that much longer, so you might have to push a little bit if you want to put some stuff in there. Yeah. More months, you might push a little bit and see what happens. Let me know how it goes. I'll be curious, it's a good case.
Yeah, I'll try some of that with you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. All right, everybody, let's get going again. And again, I apologize that we are a little behind schedule, but I figured that was what was going to happen. So again, I don't know. I'm worried about time, so I think if you guys want to just read this case, it's a pretty good one. I'll let you read this. It's long, so I think this is my dad's case actually here. Very long one. I'll let you read this. It's very interesting. Lots of symbolic stuff. So just remember this repetition compulsion thing is very important. There is a chance, by the way, to have sort of creative repetition where the repeating creates an opportunity to review, reconsider, reflect, and repair. And so repetition can have an important part of therapy. What you want to do is you want to be able the person to become a little bit aware enough of the repetition so the repetition can start becoming a little more creative. Okay? A little more creative. So, again, this is an idea where, and there's another case in the book that I don't have time to show you, but we talk about this sort of the idea of play and creativeness in the repetition. So you can start, the problem with these patterns is they become very concretized, very literal. Even though they're symbolic, they're just replaying out the same thing over and over and over again. And if you can start to get the person to be a little more creative with it, that's a good sign. You can use this as part of the therapeutic process, right? Which I call, which is the technical term we call working through. And this appears, it's something that's going to appear in analysis. It's going to appear in your life. We all do this. So it's not only a resistance, but it can function as a resistance. Okay. And what happens in therapy is that as you work through the therapy, these repetition patterns start sort of shrinking. They decrease, they become less intrusive in the person's life. Sometimes repetition can be really intrusive. Obviously, OCD kinds of things, they become, concretized and super intrusive. A lot of that has to do with brain chemistry, et cetera. But, the OCD personality disorder, obsessive compulsive personality disorder, different than OCD, by the way, we'll talk about that later, where they have lots of compulsive, repetitive patterns in their life. You'll see those things start to shrink down a little bit. Okay. And it may never disappear completely, but its durations will shorten and its influence shortens. Okay. And, like a good example of a repetition compulsion pattern can be drug use. I wrote a book about this. It's available for free. I think I posted on the thing if you want to read it. But drug use is a repetitional pattern. A compulsive drug use is a repetition pattern, whether it's a true addiction or not. It's a repeated pattern. And again, this has some of the aspects of repetition compulsion. And repetition compulsion can be resistance or non-resistance, but it does have a aspect of repetition compulsion. And what do you see, for instance, in drug addicts? And this was written by the Argentinian psychoanalyst, I think his first name is David Rosenfeld, maybe long about this. He saw a lot of drug addiction patients. And what happens is these patients, who, by the way, have personality disorder level pathology, they have this addictive pattern, repetition pattern. After a while, they're able to sort of not use the drugs anymore. But what's interesting to be noted is that they will start picking up other sort of repetitive patterns, which I can mention like coin collecting. Right. So rather than going out and seeking heroin, when they get sort of into the therapy, they involve in sort of like hobbies like coin collecting. That you go out and find that coin, you search for it and finding it, and how the sort of great feelings when they get the coin. It's like makes them feel really good. It's like a dopamine rush. And then they got to go find the next thing, right? Into the repetitive pattern. We talked about that. But so you see that sometimes in like drug addiction, you know, with a heavy duty repetitive pattern. You know, when it resolves, they find some other kind of milder, more creative repetitive pattern that replaces it, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. And a lot of us do that, right? A lot of us do that. Yes.
Well, litigation treatment is a nice kind of like, when you have one of those kind of sort of creating something outlet or something.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
just, changing that same enthusiasm for a habit into a more functional habit.
Yeah.
Whatever that.
Yeah.
Like working out or
Yeah.
something that they actually want.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And it can even be another drug. I mean, you do an AA, you know,
Coffee.
yeah. Cigarettes, you know, they replace the drinking with, you know, cigarettes, you know, I mean, it's, you know, you see it in all sorts of different ways, but yeah. And again, you know, these drug addict clients who basically have borderline level, you know, pathology are they're Roosevelt, and you saw this people in therapy for a long time, right? You know, as you'll find, these personality sort of level pathologies take a long time, a lot of intensive therapy. It wasn't happening overnight. It wasn't like, oh, stop using heroin and you give you a coin collection. No, it doesn't work that way. You know, they got the first repetition pattern has to really diminish quite a bit. And then that they, you know, when it's creative and switch to something else, right? Doesn't happen at all. You can't direct the person to do that. That works. Yeah, doesn't work that way. Okay, all right. So very interesting. Talk about superego resistance rises from a sense of guilt, and associate with this a felt need for punishment according to the dictates of the superego. So superego resistance, you'll see people who sort of need to, like, punish themselves in various ways. So Guy, you know, your case, you know, you might suspect some superego resistance going on, need to punish herself. So you might be another thing to be curious about, you know, because that could be resistance to therapy, right? Just to do some punishment, you know, there's some guilt going on buried in the unconscious. I would guess in the case there's definitely some of that guilt buried in it, right? So Freud considered this to be the most obscure, though not always the weakest of the 5 forms of resistance, but it's present a lot. You will see this underlying a lot of guilt, people, you know, acting out on their guilt in some way or symbolically representing the guilt. You know, in the case of Paul, in his aggressive thoughts about an unborn unconscious, and he punishes himself by having this symptom. And you can read the case of Cindy, I wouldn't do that. So again, activating the punishing force of superego action resistance, gaining insight in the analytic therapy. In other words, a person feels so guilty about something they never have to actually, you know, come to some realization about what's going on with them. You know, and so that's thought of as kind of like a superego resistance. So a patient reports having been tempted to steal something of significant value but refrains from doing so. We may assess to the extent that punitive aspects of his or her superego aspects of her ego ideal are integrated. Remember, the ego ideal is the part of the superego that is the best person you could possibly be, right? That we all theoretically would be striving for. The superego of an individual who refrains from stealing because of fear of punishment differs from that of another individual who does not steal because stealing would mean disappointing the person's expectation of the ego ideal. In other words, I'm not a criminal. I wouldn't steal. I'm not a criminal. You know, there's a bag of money I find on the sidewalk, you know, like, you know, part of me wants to take that money and yay, you know, I found a bag of money. I'm just going to take it and spin it. But the other part of me is saying, I'm not that person. I'm the person who would take that to the police and be responsible. That's my ideal self, right? And so again, the ego ideal can come into this, right? So besides the expectation of punishment, we also can take into consideration that patients may resist working in psychotherapy if they unconsciously fear that the psychoanalytic insight would threaten their ability to live up to the ego ideal. In other words, if I uncover something in my unconscious, you know, that I did that, or I felt I did, you know, like in one of Guy's cases, you know, some woman may have some unconscious guilt about something from the past that is not rational, but something a kid would feel guilty about. You know, they're afraid that comes up, if they uncover the motivation of that and uncover that they will threatens their ability to be this ideal person who they think they should be, right? That makes sense? In other words, we're all this ego idea, we're all this best possible person that we could be. And if therapy starts touching on things that we don't want to know about ourselves, that we feel guilty about or we feel bad about, then you can't maintain that ego ideal when we resist the therapy. Does that make sense? Good. Interesting. This comes up quite a bit. It's a little subtle. Okay, here's an example. I don't know, I'm going to probably. So this is my case. I'll give you this one. This is pretty quick. I had a guy who came in for therapy. He had been prosecuted because he had groped his stepdaughter, who was 15 years old, and she was, I wouldn't say it was pedophilia, because she was quite well developed, but obviously inappropriate. He got in trouble. The wife found out and turned him in. He got prosecuted, but he didn't get a lot. He didn't get jail time or anything. So it wasn't like, I think the court in this case actually realized that he was not like a pedophile, like a full-on pedophile. So they gave him kind of a light thing, and he was on probation and required to get therapy, and that's when he came to see me. Court appointed, by the way. Very interesting guy. I could talk more about him because he was kind of what we call a characterological person, sort of in between the neurotic level and the borderline or the narcissistic borderline level. So in between sort of gray area. I think I mentioned you guys characterological disorders last time. He was very rigid, he had a lot of things going on, but also a very smart guy. And actually, during the therapy, developed a great deal of insight. He actually did pretty well in therapy at the end of it. So again, that sort of tells you more neurotic level, right? I saw him about a year after seeing him in therapy. He was making good progress, and he developed a lot of insight, especially a lot of insight about his early childhood, and what went on in his early childhood. It's pretty good. And then one day he comes in abruptly during a session, and he asked me if I would write a letter to the court indicating they should allow him to regain possession of his guns. He had a gun collection. So can I have my guns back? I don't want to get my guns back, because when he'd been arrested, of course, they said, no, you're not going to have your guns. And the wife had the guns, and she was keeping them. She divorced him, and she kept the guns. And the court was saying he couldn't have his guns back. And so, but this was one of his passions. He was a gun collector, required his collection. And I immediately answered, this is one of the places where I was not neutral. I immediately said no. It's a hard no, because obviously as a therapist, can you imagine what kind of problems this could cause for me if I say, yeah, I'm writing a letter, get your guns back, and you get his guns back, and even anything happens, he drops a gun and it goes off and shoots somebody, or something happens, I am going to be liable for that, right? Somebody's going to come after me for that. So that's a hard no, right? But then after getting the hard no, I said to him, what does it feel like for me to tell you that that I'm not going to write a letter so you get your guns back? He went the whole thing. Oh, I got no, not at all. All the things you want. Talk about this. So what's going on with this, right? And so I was able to explore with him the request, because he knew, part of him knew that I would turn him down. Right? Of course he knew. And that came up. Well, I knew you were going to turn me down. Okay. What's going on? And over the next few weeks, he was able to articulate the anxiety that if he made good progress in therapy, that his therapy would be terminated. I would say, "Oh, you're done." And so this was his way of sort of working against the therapy by asking me about getting his guns back, and I would make me think that he was nutty and he would do something crazy, and maybe in a super ego-like authority to work against this therapy. I was able to interpret this and work through it, and actually made very good progress, actually. By the time we terminated, he'd done very, very well. I don't know if he ever got his guns back, but I know by the therapy, he was doing pretty well. It really wasn't about his guns. It was really about him wanting to make me into this figure, the authority figure. Right? And it's also related a little bit. So the thing teasing out that's so hard is that he also was related to his relationship with his father, that there's transference stuff going on too. But there's also the superego thing going on, right? And so if somebody suddenly comes to you and they ask you for something that is, that where you have to, suddenly you are required to be the authority figure in that, with the patient, right? You might consider superego resistance. And again, you'll see this in all sorts of things, I saw this a lot actually with psychotic patients, like the idea of whether in borderline patients, sometimes you have to take them to the hospital. Suddenly you got to break like confidentiality because the person is showing themselves to be a danger to themselves or other, and you've got to now break confidentiality. That could be a way of working against the therapeutic relation. So a borderline patient I'll talk to you about, I think a little bit later on, when we get the borderline personality disorder, she would do this to me. One of my patients would do this to me quite often. This was and it was kind of like a superhero resistance as well. She would decompensate and, basically have to get me to say, I think we need to go to the hospital. We need to take you to the hospital. And then she would have a reaction to that. That worked against the therapy. Now it's a superego resistance, right? Again, you'll see this sometimes. Anytime you're putting a figure in the sense of being an authority figure, you might want to start thinking about this a little bit. It's just working against the therapy. It's your client, patient doing this in order to work what's going on in therapy, or they don't want to end the therapy. Therapy's going so well, they want to keep it going. Think about this sort of thing. Okay. Negative therapeutic reaction, clinical phenomenon, peculiar to the patient's psychology, not susceptible to routine treatment, thus unrelated to the therapist's mismanagement of a therapeutic relationship. It's a worsening of a patient's condition when everything in the process calls for improvement or relief of symptoms. So the person is doing really, really well, and suddenly they're, therapy just isn't going well. And suddenly everything is getting worse. It's nothing that you're doing as the therapist, but the person just suddenly gets worse, having worse reaction. Maybe if they're at the borderline level of personality organization, they start acting out. Right? And why are they acting out suddenly? Well, it's something in the therapy they're trying to do. Okay. Freud talked about a moral factor and the sense of guilt. But I think that, to me, this relates more to the superego stuff. But there can be some overlap here. And again, in the case of Adam, that's really some overlap between this and the superego. See this sometime. Okay, Stanley Olnick talked about this, identifying depressed pre-Oedipal mother and adults experiencing their partners. And we'll talk about these internalized and externalized bad objects. I talked to you about this already a little bit. They suggest that these people who have these kind of early object relations issues may be the ones who have these negative therapeutic reactions. Okay? And it can be, in a way you could think of it as a patient externalizing his or her depression onto the psychoanalyst. And it makes it harder for you as the therapist to be effective. And it's harder when the person projecting their depression on you. And if they're doing projective identification because they have a personality disorder, then you're going to actually start feeling depressed when you see them. And that's going to make doing therapy harder, and that can be a little bit of a resistance. So your unconscious thoughts and that's about the patient frustrates them, may cause further complications and make dealing with this very difficult. I think related to projective identification, I put a question mark there, but that's my thought about it. Okay. You can see here, I don't admit it, but I am bitter. My therapist is very bitter, right? Projects on there. Projective identification, the therapist actually feels bitter. That for the patient. Okay. That can complicate things. All right, I think I'm going to let you read this case study. It's another long one. bottom line here is this is when you need to go get a consult with another experienced person. Or if the case continues to be difficult to get supervision for the case. Okay? And again, my feeling is this should become a more acceptable part of the psychotherapy culture. Continually getting consultation, supervision when you need it, even if you're an experienced therapist. And the woman I told you about that I did the group therapy with, she's been practicing 40 some years when I worked with her. She still got consultation when she had a difficult case. She had a person she worked with who was more experienced than her, and she would go and get consultations regularly, when she ran against something. And I was very, very impressed with that. And I think that should be more part of the culture. Okay. I'll let you guys read this case. Trying to think if this is, yeah. Okay, let you guys read this. All right. Resistance is part of the psychic surface. Some patients use charm, humor, thoughtfulness toward others, extreme intellectualization, all these defense mechanisms disarm the psychoanalyst or psychotherapist. Some of these characters, again, their defense mechanisms can be difficulty in distinguishing defensive things versus resistance. So one way to think of it is that when you see a defense, you can always suspect a resistance, especially when you're first starting to do therapy with someone. So you guys are doing short-term therapy. So short-term therapy, think of resistance. Think of the defense things as resistance, because you're only doing a short-term. It'll come up right away. And vice versa, think of the resistances as defenses. There's a big Venn diagram, they overlap a lot. Okay. Some patients exhibit resistance by becoming obedient children. I think when I'm in therapy, that's what I do. That's one of my resistances. Anything the therapist does, I'm trying to be a good patient, just do everything, follow along. Whatever they tell me to do, or whatever is expected of me, even if they don't say anything, but unconsciously, whatever the expectation is, I try to just do that, right? So that's another form of resistance. And once that gets interpreted to you, then some patients are never late. They do everything by the book. They're perfect, accept everything you say to them. They do all the homework you give them, and yet they're not making any progress. You can start thinking that might be a resistance. And I think that's regardless of the type of therapy you're doing. Other patients try to control their analysts or psychotherapists, wondering aloud if they know a particular thing. They'll ask you, have you read a certain book? Have you seen this movie? They'll do sort of things that are sort of controlling. Patients overemphasize interest or affect might indicate a corresponding repressed one. Patient presenting with masochism may be defending against their unconscious sadism. So that's another thing. Sometimes what you see on the surface is the opposite of what's really going on. Patients can manifest resistance by giving their therapist a gift, in quotes. This can be an actual gift. Anybody gotten presents from their patients? I think you were talking, somebody was talking, yeah, you're talking about it. It can be an actual, but she was leaving, so maybe that's okay. But it can be an actual gift. This is also a way to control your patients. And I have a good example of this. I'll give you examples of my own personal life here, but I don't care if you know about my weird psychological problems at this point. I was getting psychoanalytic therapy from an analyst. I think I told you guys about her already. She was a neo-Kleinian analyst, which is a certain kind of object relations oriented analytic stance from the British School of Object Relations. The Kleinians are very into Melanie Klein, very famous female psychoanalyst, talked about anal stage and the idea of feces being expelled and being kept in, and talk about feces babies and all this stuff about shit, basically. And so I started seeing this woman. I knew she was inclining. I didn't think about it, but I kept having dreams about shit. Like I'd go into a room, a bathroom, and the toilet would start overflowing, and shit would flow everywhere, and I have to clean it up, or I'd be covered in shit and fall over me, and I kept having these shit dreams. And I was ringing every week. I'd just sit on the couch and yeah, shit dream, going on, And she just sat there, just didn't say anything. And then, because when I was doing it unconscious, I was giving her a gift. I knew she was inclining, Melanie Klein. That was very interesting. She was very interested in shit. So I was giving my Kleinian analyst, my Melanie Klein substitute, all sorts of shit dreams, right? I was also, by doing this, giving her shit, right? by forwarding therapy, right? And, week after week, I have this shit. And then one day I'm lying on the couch and the shit was sitting there. And she drops an interpretation. The client is very famous for the demonic interpretation. She drops interpretation like, interesting, you're trying to my shit. I think you're giving me a gift, trying to control me by shit, talking about shit and look at stuff that really is like going on for you. And you're giving me shit, forwarding therapy. It's like somebody took a hammer and hit me in the head. Oh, like revelation, really hard. I mean, I felt like I walked out of the office, and then all the dreams stopped. Right? I mean, getting stuff that I didn't want to deal with, right? It was something else. So this was, good example from my own life of this kind of stuff, the psychic surface stuff. So again, you got to be careful. You don't think everything the client brings you is some sort of resistance, because then you can get a little paranoid and think everything they bring you is some form of resistance. But you do have to be listening for it. Okay. And especially this controlling thing. The clients love to control you unconsciously, try to control you unconsciously. Okay. And this may be a pattern from their childhood too. This could be transference where they felt they had to control the parent. So if you're hearing, history and you're hearing about a parent that can be like an out of control parent, a parent that's not doing a good job, they're sort of out of control, and the child is parentified, where they have to control the parent, they have to do the parenting, you guys know about parentified children, right? You can start suspecting that there may be transference. This could be transference instead, or it could be mixed in with this. The transference could be mixed in with this resistance. So it could be a resistance, a psychic surface resistance, or it could be transference resistance mixed in. So especially parentified children, you want to be listening to that. Okay. And again, activities of resistance, acting out. One guy, Thomas, used to cancel unacceptable thoughts and affects and reconstruction of his childhood by doing magical activities in the analyst's office. During his treatment, he would unconsciously make a downward gesture of his hand before getting up from his chair. He'd be like, he'd get up, and later on, it came out that he was magically flushing the toilet, as if the therapeutic explanations or interpretations were shit, again, to be flushed away, right? And this is a direct representation of resistance. It can be some kind of activity, behavior that they do in the office. You might see it looks a little odd. It can also be activities outside the office. We call this acting out. You may have heard of this kind of thing, acting out. I'm going to let you read this about the paperweight acting out here. This is a pretty good case. It's long. I'll let you read that. But acting out, and we'll see when we get to start talking about personality disorders, that a lot of times with personality disorders, the resistance is they acting out. There's more acting out than with personality disorders. Unconscious, they're just completely outside, right? So they might have some transference thing with you, and then they act out and go out and act that out. Somebody else outside the therapeutic hour. So you have to, again, with personality disorder level pathology, you've got to be aware, be thinking a little bit, wondering about acting out. Okay. Built-in transference. This is where somebody starts seeing you, if you're a psychoanalytic therapist, they see you after seeing some other kind of therapist. And they bring in their transference and their feelings and expectations from their other therapist into you. This is what I was telling you before, like if they start self-disclosing, like suddenly, and they've had another therapist, it can be somewhat sometimes they just want to get to where they were. They become comfortable with their previous transference. They just want to put that onto you, right? And so you got to be careful, but especially down in the LA area where a lot of people have been in therapy. Especially if you get down to LA, we're close to LA. Everybody, therapists is like having a gym membership. You see a lot of people who've had many therapists, and so they may bring a built-in transference into you. And this can be kind of a pain in the ass to deal with, right? Because they expect you to be like the other therapist, and you've got to make clear that you're not. But at the same time, you've got to develop that therapeutic line so they don't run away. Okay? And if they've been seeing lots of different therapists over the years, one after the other, it may be that the other therapists weren't able to establish a therapy compliance with them. That could be a fault of the therapist, or that could be a resistance on the part of the patient. So that's all things to ascertain and be aware of. Okay? Or it could be that they have been seeing people in like university clinics where they're only seen for a certain amount of time and then they're cast off, or like people in the, Ventura County social work thing where they sign a social worker to a family or a kid or whatever, and then, yank them out and replace them with somebody else after a while. Very bad practice in my opinion. But you'll see that. So there's a lot of reasons behind it, but it's definitely worth considering the built-in transfers, because they may come in thinking that you're going to just suddenly stop the therapy at some point, and which was very traumatic for them the last time they were in therapy. They may expect that you're going to do these kind of things. And so again, you want to be aware of this kind of stuff. Okay? Yeah, that's all I'll say about that. This is a big thing in LA, I think. Okay, and I'll let you see this. Another case history. I have a lot of case histories in this. This is a good one. This is my dad's case here about the cat killer guy. And this is where the therapist had to break, confidentiality or, abstinence or neutrality and say, if you keep killing cats, I can't see you anymore. Right. So an appropriate time to break the neutrality. Okay. And putting boundaries about the therapy. And again, that will become important with people who have personality disorder level pathology, that you may need to set a container, a boundary on what a person can and can't do while they're in therapy. More so than with somebody who's just neurotic. Okay. So once you ascertain that developmental level, they're in the personality disorder level, then you may need to put more of a container around therapy. I can't do therapy with you if you're going to keep killing cats. Yes.
We just talked about supervision, so why I'm curious what you think, but would you say the same thing if your client is using like derogatory terms that you don't like? When you bring that conversation up to them to not use it in therapy?
I would, for me, initially, I would be curious about that. I would say it's interesting. I noticed you use this term. I wonder what's going on with that. Why you would say that, and just explore it a little bit. If it's pulling up a lot of countertransference for you, that is something that you should go to your supervisor and talk about. Why is it pulling it up for you? Why is it bothering you so much? Especially said the verbal thing you're saying. Why is that bothering you so much that you feel like the therapy can't continue? But I would be curious about it. I would want to know why they use the term. Same with like a racist thing or any of this kind of thing. I would want to explore that, because there's probably a lot of really interesting stuff underlying that. Where did they get that from? Oh, well, I heard that, these kind of people are, bad or whatever. Where did that come from? Where you heard that first? Explore a little bit, see, because you may get something really interesting. So my dad, who's an immigrant to this country and has a heavy accent, in a lot of his writings, he'll talk about how his patients will react because they realize he's an immigrant or he's got an accent from some other place. And rather than, and sometimes in derogatory ways, and rather than react to that, they just explore it. And a lot of really interesting stuff comes out of that. So I would encourage you to try to explore it first. And if it's really bothering you, then you got to figure out why it's in the therapy ritual, why it's affecting you so much. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And you'll also find people, by the way, it's not just racism, it can be different political opinions. It can be, the Chiefs versus Philadelphia Eagles, whatever it's going to be, your opinion, your views on this is something as therapists we have to bracket off. That's not what we're doing in the ritual room or health therapy, but in the ritual therapy, that's not what we're doing. It's not like you're sharing things with friends, or somebody you just met. This is a ritual, right? And in that ritual, whatever you think that no, and you keep that to yourself. This is the abstinence bit, right? The abstinence bit. This is, so my dad worked with people who are children of Holocaust perpetrators, right? And, you bring a lot of stuff into the therapy that is difficult, so you have to put that, it's not that they're the perpetrators, but even relatives are perpetrators, put that aside. If you work with child molesters, by the way, you're probably not going to do this kind of work with a child molester, but you might find out. You might find out during the course of therapy that somebody has done something, criminal like that. And then, of course, there's always the question, what legally you do? But besides the legal question, how do you deal with that in the ritual of the therapy, right? And there's no answer to that. I mean, it's going to depend on the situation, right? But the thing is, like in this case, the guy killing cats, right? And suddenly hate the guy, oh, get out of here, you're a horrible cat killer, Well, now he's never going to get better. He's going to kill more cats. But maybe if you explore that with him, or say, look, we want to do therapy. Let's, you got to stop killing the cats while we do this. Maybe you'll get to the point where you have to do that. You got to weigh all that stuff, right, as part of the therapeutic encounter. Very, very important. But this is a lot of therapists get tripped up by this.
Yeah, we just had a big conversation about it in our group supervision, like the DBT.
Yeah, good. Yeah, the DBT guys, of course, are going to get a lot of this because you're dealing with personality sort of people. So you're going to get all sorts of acting out and things that, and again, this can be a form of resistance. I killed some cats and then I don't have to do therapy because the therapists are going to hate me now and they'll kick me out. Okay, maybe that's, but if you explore it with them and they can't get away with it, they can't get away with exploring it. You got to stop doing it, but we're going to talk about it. Then maybe, something good can happen out of it. Right. And then you got to know yourself. You got to know when, what you can deal with and what you can't deal with. Maybe, and there's a good example. This is somebody who's been molested themselves as a kid, and now they have to work with a child molester. They just can't deal with it. They might have even been through therapy, right? They might have dealt with a lot of stuff there, but they know now that this is too painful for them, right? So knowing yourself is very important too, right? Knowing where you live. As Clint Eastwood said, man's got to know, man and woman, got to know their limitations, right? For that movie, right? I don't know which movie that was. Dirty Harry, maybe? No, Dirty Harry. Okay. All right. Yeah, you got to know your limitations, right? Very important. All right. So I'll let you read about the cat killer here. All right. Transference dilution. This is the other thing that also comes along because you're in LA. So people are seeing you, they're getting close to some issue, it's coming up to them. So what they do is they just go add another therapist. They start seeing 2 therapists, 3 therapists at the same time. They do group therapy over here. They see you once a week for CBT. They're seeing somebody over here for, God knows what. And they dilute the transference. They don't have to have a full-on transference with just you. They can dilute it around. In DBT, this is very good because the borderline transference drives you crazy. And so you dilute it among a treatment team. And that actually is, a nice part of the design of DBT that allows that. It allows it to be more effective because difficult to deal with clients, but in sort of other therapy where you're doing individual therapy with people, the transference gets diluted, and then because it gets diluted, it never has a chance to resolve. And so this is another thing. Somebody's seen a bunch of therapists. You've got to decide, hey, you've seen a bunch of therapists. I really can't work with you unless you're just going to see me, because we're not going to get to the point in therapy where we're going to get to the healing stuff. Because you're just going to resist it by just diluting the transference among a bunch of different people. So this is again another thing, another judgment call that you can make, or you can keep seeing the person, and maybe at a certain point, if you can, once the therapeutic alliance is established, you can start talking to them about maybe, what are the people they're seeing, what other kinds of things they're doing. By the way, this is not just therapists. It's a problem now in our profession. It's not just therapists, not just the actually people that we got to people that try for their clients. It's also life coaches. It's also dating coaches. It's also work coaches. I don't think you have to work too much stuff. Just hold me and go. It's a great private. I mean, there's all sorts of different kinds of pseudo therapy. It doesn't mean that they're seeing a chiropractor or an acupuncturist, and that's fine. I've seen people with acupuncture all the time. I was a dean in acupuncture, so I like acupuncture. Students call me the patient because I practice on it. Very painful. But I mean, not talking about like alternative medicine or something, you know, I mean, a lot of this stuff is really great, but I'm talking about things that have a pseudo therapeutic function, life coaches, business coaches, you know, you name it, there's a bazillion of them out there. And a lot, if you're in LA, a lot of people are going to come and see you. They're going to have seen these before, they'll continue to see them. You know, hopefully what you're doing is they will realize what you're doing is a little deeper and have some value for them that maybe they can pull the transfers in, focusing on your therapy. You know, but there's a problem in LA where everybody sees a bazillion and a bazillion therapists. So something to be considered, look out for. Tim? All right. Now the problem with that is that there are some therapists, Leon Wormser, the old school psychoanalyst, who actually had he worked a lot with drug addicts, and he would have his drug addicts enroll in Narcotics Anonymous, and his alcoholic patients enroll in AA. He felt that these other kinds of pseudo therapy groups could function as auxiliary superegos, and he thought for drug addicted patients this was useful. So I don't know if, you know, because drug addicted patients generally have, you know, personality disorder level pathology. I don't know for other personality disorders who are not addicts, whether or not having some auxiliary therapy group thing could be beneficial or not. I think that is to be determined. That'd be a good dissertation topic, by the way, for you guys. But Wormser was very successful treating drug addicts, and he would have them do NA and have it function as their superego to keep them in check so they wouldn't act out while he was trying to do therapy with them. Take with a grain of salt. I don't know. Yes.
How would this relate to like minor clients that their parents are taking them in, and basically the parents are taking them to a whole bunch of different therapists? Like I had
Yeah, I think it's just. I think again, I would talk to the parent and say, I think, you know, you should just pick one person to work with the kid. You know, not be taking around a bunch of people. And by the way, you probably also need to know therapy. Because one thing you'll find with the client, the kids, one thing I do know about kids, it's usually the parents. A lot of times the kids acting out whatever they're doing is a rational response to their irrational parents. So that's probably the recommendation I would give, you know. So what can you do? I mean, they're going to do what they do. You can try to make a suggestion.
in the fall, I had a few minor clients, and the parents were just like, they want a quick fix, basically.
Yep.
They just take the kid to get assessment without telling you
Yep.
that other therapist.
Yep. Very common. Yeah, my friend, she's a lot of kids, practicing cameras, a lot of kids, and she felt the same thing. Very typical. Yeah, you got to get the parents, and you know, I mean, maybe it can be a quick fix. Maybe it's something that can be fixed quickly, but generally, it's good if the parents come in and have a session. So that might be, we suggest the parents come in and have a session on their own, without the kids, and see how things go, you know, and talk to them about this. It's tough. That's a tough one. Because you know it's not good for the kids. You know, the parents just want them instantly to be fixed, right? It tells you something about the parents, right? Okay. All right. All right. Last words. Resistance. It's normal. We all do resistance. So don't think of it as pathology necessarily, but it's just something we have to deal with as therapists. It's not a deliberate attempt to struggle with the therapist. It's just something that comes up during therapy, but it's going to be required that you have to deal with this. Not only in the beginning, but throughout treatment, but especially at the beginning, because in the beginning, if you don't deal with it, people will not show up for therapy. They'll run away. Okay. So you want to get people to develop the alliance, so they'll keep coming, and then you're going to be dealing with it throughout therapy. Okay.